Welcome to the Sleepy Geographer. This is a place where you can let the noise of the day drift away, where the only thing that flows steadily forward is the story. Tonight, our journey follows rivers, those winding, restless ribbons of water that carve valleys, feed fields, and carry life quietly across the earth. Before we set off downstream, I would love to know where you are listening from, perhaps beside a city river, tucked away in a quiet countryside, or somewhere far from the nearest flowing water. If you enjoy these gentle explorations, a like and a subscribe helps the channel flow along too. And for those of you already subscribed, thank you. You're very much part of this calm little community. I should warn you though, I hope this video isn't so interesting that it keeps you awake, but if it does, at least by the time sleep finally catches you, you'll know a little more about the rivers of our world, so let us begin. If rivers are the veins of the earth, carrying water as blood carries life, then what stories might they tell if we listened closely enough? Rivers are ancient travellers. They are older than the cities we know, older than the maps we draw, and in some cases older even than the mountains they run through. They are the quiet sculptors of the landscape, reshaping valleys, meadows and coastlines with a patience that makes human history look like the blink of an eye. This video will follow their journey from the moment they are born in high mountains or in the thaw of distant snowfields, to the wide plains where they spread and slow, to the deltas where they finally surrender themselves to the sea. Along the way, we'll see how rivers have carried not only water but also culture, myth and memory, how they have nourished crops, built empires, inspired stories, and at times reminded humanity of their untamable force. We will explore the science of rivers, how they shape the land, how they breathe life into ecosystems, and how they respond to the changing climate of our times. And we will wander into their human stories too, the river cities, the sacred waters, the bridges, the canals, and the poetry that rivers have left behind like ripples on the surface of memory. Think of this as a gentle voyage downstream. There will be no rushing, no need to paddle frantically, just the steady rhythm of water, a story that meanders but never loses its way, and the quiet company of rivers guiding us onward. But perhaps the most curious question is this: if rivers are indeed the veins of the earth, then what does that make us? The ones who live along their banks, drink from their flow, and build our lives around their restless paths. Every river begins humbly. Before it becomes a grand torrent winding through valleys or a mighty current cutting its way to the sea, it starts as something delicate, a raindrop on a leaf, a flake of snow settling on a mountainside, or a bead of groundwater bubbling up through stone. The beginnings of rivers are rarely dramatic. They start in silence, unnoticed, and often far from the places where their influence will one day be felt. To understand where a river is born, one must look upward, to the sky. The story begins with clouds, those vast reservoirs drifting above us. Within them, water is constantly cycling, evaporated from oceans, lakes, and even the leaves of trees. This endless process, the hydrological cycle, is one of nature's great recycling systems. Water rises as vapor, condenses into droplets, and returns as rain, hail, or snow. What seems like a simple shower is actually the closing of a loop that has been running since the dawn of the Earth's atmosphere. The very raindrop that falls on your window could once have been part of a glacier, a wave in the Pacific Ocean, or the steam from a volcanic vent millions of years ago. When those drops finally fall to the ground, most disappear quickly, sinking into the soil or being drunk by plants. But some begin a longer journey. Rain that lands on steep slopes often cannot soak in fast enough, so it runs downhill, pulled by gravity. At first, these are tiny rivulets, too small to deserve the name stream. They weave between stones, glisten across moss, and gather into shallow depressions in the earth. A trickle meets another trickle, and together they grow stronger. Soon a sheet of water flows down the slope, etching out small channels in the soil. If you have ever watched rainwater race down the gutter, you have seen a miniature version of this process. many small flows combining, always drawn toward the lowest ground. Snow plays its own special role. In colder climates, the rivers of tomorrow are stored in white silence for months on end. Each flake adds to the mass of snowpack, building a frozen reservoir on mountain ridges and high plateaus. When spring sunlight returns, that storehouse begins to melt. What looks like a simple thaw is in fact the unlocking of a year's worth of water. Meltwater seeps into cracks, gathers in rivulets, and cascades downhill in sudden rushes. This is why so many great rivers have their source in snowy mountains. The Alps feed the Rhine, the Himalayas give rise to the Ganges and the Yangtze, and the Rockies release the Colorado. Snow is not just winter decoration, it is a time-delayed river, waiting for warmth to set it free. Sometimes rivers are born not from sky or snow, but from the ground itself. Springs occur when underground water, filtered through layers of rock and soil, finds a path back to the surface. A spring can be as modest as a trickle feeding a woodland pool, or as spectacular as a geyser bursting skyward with boiling force. In both cases, what emerges is part of the same grand cycle. Water that once fell as rain, travelled through hidden aquifers, and now begins again as surface flow. Many famous rivers trace their origins to such springs. The Thames begins at a quiet Gloucestershire spring, the Seine has its source near Dijon, and the Jordan flows from several freshwater springs in the hills of Lebanon. From these humble beginnings, entire civilizations downstream would one day flourish. However it starts, as rainfall, meltwater, or spring, the first moments of a river are fragile. It may dry up in a warm wind or vanish into thirsty soil, but if it endures, if enough droplets combine, then the flow strengthens. The water gathers into channels which deepen and widen over time. Tiny brooks converge into streams, streams feed into rivers, and rivers carve out valleys that will carry their course for thousands of years. There is something poetic in that transformation. Countless individual drops, each insignificant on its own, merging into something that cannot be ignored. The drama of those beginnings is hidden in plain sight. Imagine a raindrop falling on a mountainside in the Andes. That single drop may join with others to become part of the Amazon, travelling thousands of miles before entering the Atlantic Ocean. Another drop falling only a few steps away might find itself destined for the Pacific. The divide between basins can be so subtle that it is little more than a ridge in the soil, yet it decides whether water flows east or west, whether it nourishes one ecosystem or another. This invisible geography, known as a watershed divide, is one of the quiet wonders of the earth. As these newborn streams gather strength, they begin shaping the land immediately. Even the smallest flows can carve furrows in soil, moving grains of sand and pebbles inch by inch. Over time, entire gullies are formed, which funnel water into larger channels. With every rainfall, with every snowmelt, these channels deepen. It is astonishing to think that mighty canyons, some hundreds of meters deep, began with nothing more than water's gentle insistence, repeated year after year. The air around these beginnings often carries a special stillness. In alpine meadows, one hears the first trickles threading through grasses and moss, accompanied by the distant drip of melting ice. In forested hills, the sound is a faint burble, hidden under leaves and roots. In desert springs, the sudden appearance of fresh water transforms dry dust into an oasis, drawing animals and plants like a magnet. Each of these settings is different, yet they all represent the same beginning. Water setting out on a journey it has made countless times before. What makes this process endlessly fascinating is not just the science of hydrology, but the perspective it offers. The water we drink today has passed through this cycle countless times, flowing as rain, ice, groundwater, or vapour long before humans appeared. Every river you know is part of a timeless rhythm, born again and again from the simplest of beginnings. When you hold a glass of water, you're holding something that has been a glacier, a cloud, a spring, and a raindrop, perhaps many times over. there is a quiet humility in realizing that. Rivers remind us that grand things do not always begin grandly. The largest flows of the Amazon start as drips in distant mountains. The mighty Nile, lifeline of ancient Egypt, begins in tiny headwaters scattered across East Africa. The Mississippi begins not as a vast brown torrent, but as a modest stream flowing out of Lake Itasca in Minnesota. Their origins are so unassuming that you could step across them without noticing. And yet from these modest births come forces powerful enough to shape continents. The beginning of a river is like the first note of a song, or the spark before a flame. It carries within it the promise of something much greater, a journey that will touch landscapes, ecosystems, and civilizations. In every raindrop that slides down a blade of grass, in every snowflake that melts into a trickle, there is the potential for a river. And with every new river, the earth renews its veins, pulsing quietly, carrying life forward in an endless cycle. A newborn stream begins its life quietly, often as little more than a wandering ribbon of water. At first it is shy, slipping between stones and grass, trickling across soil that drinks greedily at every chance. Left alone, it might fade back into the ground, swallowed by thirsty roots. But when more trickles gather, when the slopes and gullies keep delivering their drops, something changes. Water becomes motion with intent. The first outlines of a river are sketched. In geography, there is no strict threshold that declares when a stream becomes a river. It is not a matter of a precise width or depth. Rather, it is about persistence and scale. A gully on a hillside may only run after heavy rain, but a brook that flows year-round begins to feel like a permanent fixture. As those brooks converge into larger flows, they earn new names: creeks, runs, forks, and eventually rivers. Language here is wonderfully inconsistent, a reflection of human history as much as geography. A creek in North America can be a modest trickle you could hop over, but in Australia the same word might be used for a broad river that swells with seasonal rains. Across the world, people have given these small waters their own affectionate names. In Scotland, a stream is often called a burn, a word that captures the bright, lively sound of water tumbling over rocks. In Spain, especially in the drier regions, a stream bed that only flows seasonally is an arroyo. In the deserts of Arabia, a similar feature is a wadi, sometimes dry for months, then suddenly transformed into a torrent by flash floods. These terms remind us that streams are not only physical features but also cultural ones. The names tell us how people relate to water in their landscape, whether as a constant presence, a seasonal visitor, or a dramatic surprise. As streams gather, they begin to carve channels. Water is endlessly patient in this work. Every pebble carried downstream, every grain of sand shifted, helps to shape the bed beneath. Over months and years, a narrow trickle scours out a deeper groove, creating a channel that holds the flow even when rains pause. When one stream meets another, their combined force grows. Soon, instead of disappearing into soil, the flow cuts through it, creating a clear path. These convergences are like friendships. Together, the streams achieve more than they could alone. Think of a small gully after rainfall. Water rushes down in thin threads, foaming briefly before sinking away. Now imagine several gullies side by side, all draining into the same hollow. Their waters meet, swirling together, and the hollow becomes a brook. Add more brooks, and that brook becomes a creek. Add still more, and the creek transforms into a river, with currents strong enough to carry driftwood, fish, and eventually boats. This gradual gathering shows how scale emerges from simplicity, how the many become one. The character of a stream is shaped by the land it flows through. A mountain brook born high above the tree line is often steep, cold, and fast. It tumbles noisily over stones, creating rapids and little waterfalls full of bubbles and spray. In contrast, a lowland creek meandering through meadowland may flow slowly and quietly, edged with reeds and willows. Both are streams, but their personalities could not be more different. The mountain brook shouts while the meadow creek whispers. When people encounter these streams, they often form deep connections. Villages grow around them, mills are built beside them, and children play in their shallows. The intimacy of small streams has always been different from the grandeur of great rivers. You can cup your hands and drink directly from a mountain brook, something far less appealing when you stand beside a wide brown river in flood. Small streams feel personal, familiar, neighbours in the geography of daily life. Streams also nurture life in subtle ways. Even the smallest trickle supports mosses, algae, and aquatic insects. Frogs and salamanders lay their eggs in quiet pools, while birds drink and bathe in the shallow edges. These microecosystems are astonishingly rich considering their modest size. As streams grow larger, the variety of life expands, with fish colonizing deeper pools and plants thriving along fertile banks. The joining of streams not only increases flow but also connects habitats, allowing species to spread and interact. What is fascinating is how the joining of streams is mirrored in language itself. Many rivers are formed by forks: the North Fork, the South Fork, the East Branch. These names preserve the memory of their smaller beginnings. In some regions, the names of the contributing streams remain alongside the larger river they create, as though the land itself refuses to let those smaller waters be forgotten. Hydrologists sometimes trace a river's true source by following the longest upstream branch, but locals often insist the source is wherever tradition says it is. Once again, geography and culture entwine. There's also poetry in the way streams wander before deciding on their direction. Some split into braids, weaving and rejoining, testing paths as though uncertain which valley to choose. Others cut determinedly in a single line, arrowing toward lower ground. Whichever form they take, they are united by gravity's gentle tug. The slope of the land, the softness of the soil, and the weight of water itself determine the path, but the outcome always feels organic, like handwriting across the earth. To stand at the meeting point of two streams is to watch a simple miracle. Two modest flows come together, and suddenly the water looks different. It deepens, quickens, and becomes something greater than the sum of its parts. This process repeats endlessly across landscapes. The quiet alchemy of streams becoming rivers. Human imagination has often been caught by these junctions. In Roman times, shrines were built where streams joined, honouring the spirits of water. In Chinese poetry, the joining of streams was a metaphor for friendship or love. In modern times, hydrologists map these junctions carefully, for they reveal the branching structure of entire watersheds. From space, river networks resemble the veins in a leaf, each tiny capillary feeding into larger veins, until all converge in a single main channel. The comparison is not only poetic but also scientifically accurate. Both leaf and river follow patterns of efficiency, distributing nutrients or water across wide surfaces. Streams in their earlier stages remind us of the power of accumulation. A single drop is nothing, a trickle is fragile, but add enough of them together and they become a force that reshapes the land. This is why the English poet John Clare once called streams the firstborn of rivers. They may look delicate, but within them lies the blueprint of the mighty waterways to come. So, a brook in a forest, a burn on a hillside, an arroyo in a dry plain, or a wadi waiting for the rains. Each is part of the same story. Different names, different landscapes, but always the same patient process. Water gathering itself, building strength, and flowing towards something greater. To watch streams become rivers is to watch potential turning into reality, drop by drop, until the earth itself bears the mark of their passage. When water gathers into a river, it does not simply pass through the land like a traveller on a borrowed road. Instead, it becomes an architect, a patient sculptor that reshapes the earth with every passing season. A river may seem soft, almost fragile compared to the hardness of stone, but give it time and it will carve valleys, split canyons, and build landscapes that defy imagination. This is the quiet paradox of rivers. Their strength lies not in sudden violence, but in endless persistence. The work begins with erosion. As water flows, it exerts force on the bed and banks of its channel, Fast currents pry loose grains of sand, pebbles, and sometimes even boulders. Each fragment lifted is carried along, knocking against others, grinding down the surface below. Scientists call this abrasion, and it is one of the ways rivers wear away at their own pathways. Imagine millions of stones tumbled endlessly like beads in a drum. Over centuries, even the hardest rock gives way. Another process is hydraulic action, which sounds like something an engineer might build, but is simply the raw pressure of water itself. When river currents push into cracks in rock, they force air and water deeper inside. Over time, this repeated pounding loosens and shatters the rock. What begins as a tiny fissure can eventually widen into a cave or split an entire cliff face. One could say rivers know how to exploit weaknesses, not with haste, but with persistence. Then comes solution, sometimes called corrosion, where water dissolves minerals directly. This is most noticeable in limestone regions, where rivers carve underground passages, sinkholes, and caverns. The spectacular caves of Slovenia, the karst landscapes of southern China, and the underground rivers of Mexico are all born from this quiet chemistry. To the casual eye, the water looks innocent, but hidden in those drops are acids strong enough to hollow mountains given enough years. Once a river has loosened and removed material, it becomes a transporter. Sediment is carried downstream in three main ways. The largest boulders roll or bounce along the riverbed in a process called traction or saltation. Smaller particles, such as sand, are suspended within the current, floating like tea leaves in a stirred cup. The finest materials, silts and clays, remain in suspension for vast distances, giving rivers their distinctive colours. The Yellow River of China, for example, carries so much fine sediment that it looks almost opaque, while the Rio Negro in the Amazon basin runs dark and clear because it holds little suspended matter. The load a river carries is constantly shifted, picked up in one place and dropped in another. This deposition shapes landscapes as surely as erosion does. When rivers lose energy, perhaps when the slope flattens or when the water spreads across a wide floodplain, they lay down their burden. Gravel and sand form bars and banks. Finer silts settle across meadows, enriching soils. Over thousands of years, these repeated deposits can create entire plains of astonishing fertility. This is why so many agricultural civilizations grew beside great rivers. Every flood was destructive, yes, but it also renewed the soil with a gift of nutrients. The carving of valleys is one of the most visible results of a river's patience. In youthful stages, rivers run swiftly in steep terrain, cutting deep V-shaped valleys. The Alps and Himalayas are full of such valleys, where torrents roar between cliffs and waterfalls tumble down sheer drops. With time, as the land erodes and the river matures, valleys broaden. The once steep walls soften into gentler slopes, leaving room for meadows, forests, and fields. The river, once restless and narrow, now meanders across a wider plain. Sometimes, though, the carving is dramatic. When rivers are trapped within resistant rock, they slice gorges and canyons of breathtaking depth. The Grand Canyon in Arizona, carved by the Colorado River, is perhaps the most famous example. Over millions of years, the river cut downward through layer after layer of sandstone, limestone, and shale, creating cliffs that reveal nearly 2 billion years of Earth's history. Standing at the rim, it is hard to believe that this vast chasm was made not by cataclysm, but by the steady persistence of flowing water. Yet rivers everywhere are performing the same task on smaller scales, gnawing quietly at their landscapes. Meanders are another of nature's elegant designs. As rivers enter flatter terrain, their currents slow and begin to wander. The water flows faster on the outer edge of a bend and slower on the inner edge. Faster water erodes the bank, slower water deposits sediment. This imbalance exaggerates the curve, making bends more pronounced over time. Eventually, meanders loop so tightly that they almost meet themselves. When the river finally cuts through the narrow neck, it abandons the old loop, leaving behind a crescent-shaped oxbow lake. These quiet lakes are reminders of how rivers are never static. They are always redrawing their maps, one curve at a time. Beyond meanders lie floodplains, broad expanses of flat land built from centuries of deposition. During floods, rivers spill over their banks and spread thin sheets of water across the plain. As the water slows, it leaves behind silt and clay, renewing the land. This is why floodplains, though risky places to build houses, are often among the richest soils for farming. The Nile's yearly floods were once so regular that ancient Egyptians built their calendar around them. Each inundation meant not disaster, but renewal, a rhythm that sustained their civilization for thousands of years. Yet rivers are not always kind. Their reshaping of the land can be destructive to human endeavours. Villages built too close to eroding banks may find their fields disappearing season by season. Roads and bridges can be undermined by shifting channels. Entire towns have had to move as rivers migrated across floodplains. To the river, such changes are natural. To humans, they can feel catastrophic. This tension between human permanence and river restlessness is an old story, one that continues today as climate change alters patterns of flooding and erosion. Even so, there is beauty in the way rivers create variety. Without their erosion, valleys would be lifeless plateaus. Without their deposition, plains would be barren. Without their meanders, the land would lack the rich mosaics of wetlands, oxbows and marshes that support so much wildlife. In every stage, rivers remind us that the land beneath our feet is not fixed but in motion. The hills we admire, the cliffs we climb, the fertile fields we depend upon, all are the legacy of flowing water. Perhaps the most humbling part of this story is the timescale. A person might see only the tiniest change in a river's course within their lifetime, a bank shifting or a meander cutting across a field. But give that same river 1,000,000 years, and it will rearrange mountains. Water never hurries, yet it never stops. Its patience is its power. So when you look at a valley or stand on the edge of a canyon or gaze across a winding floodplain, remember that you are witnessing the handiwork of rivers. They do not shout as they work, nor do they demand recognition. Yet with every drop, every current, every turn, they shape the very surface of the world. What seems like a gentle flow is, in truth, one of the most powerful forces on earth. A sculptor whose medium is time, whose chisel is water, and whose gallery is the landscape we live within. When a river swells beyond its banks and spreads across the surrounding land, it might at first appear as a natural disaster. To the farmer watching helplessly as his fields vanish under brown water, or to the villager moving possessions to higher ground, floods are a source of fear. Yet hidden within these unruly waters lies a gift that has sustained humanity since its earliest days, the creation of fertile soil. Floodplains, those broad expanses of flat land bordering rivers, are among the richest and most life-giving areas on Earth, precisely because they are shaped by floods. Every time a river overflows, it slows down. The water that once rushed forward now spreads thinly over fields and meadows. As its speed drops, the river loses the power to carry its sediment load, and so it drops it. Coarse sand and gravel settle close to the channel, while finer silts and clays drift farther across the plain. Layer by layer, year by year, the land builds up. In this way, floodplains become vast natural gardens, enriched by minerals washed down from mountains and hills far away. For agriculture, there is hardly a better soil recipe. One striking feature of these processes is the levee. A levee is a natural embankment formed alongside the river channel itself. When a river floods, it drops its heavier sediment first, right at the edges. Over time, these repeated deposits create raised banks higher than the surrounding plain. To stand upon a levee is to stand on ground literally built by the river itself. These natural ridges help contain future floods, although not always perfectly. Human engineers have long copied this idea, building artificial levees and dikes, but the original versions were sculpted by water alone, Perhaps the most famous partnership between river and floodplain is found in Egypt. For thousands of years, the Nile's annual inundation was the metronome of Egyptian life. Each summer, rains in the distant Ethiopian highlands swelled the river, sending waves of water northward. By late summer, the Nile spilled across its valley, covering fields with a shallow, silty sheet. When the waters withdrew months later, they left behind a rich black earth so fertile that crops seemed to grow almost effortlessly. Wheat, barley, flax and vegetables thrived, and with them a civilization arose that would endure for millennia. The ancient Egyptians revered this cycle to such an extent that their entire calendar was built around it. They divided the year into 3 seasons: Akhet, the time of flooding, Pere, the time of planting, and Shemu, the time of harvest. Without the Nile's gift, the desert would have made large-scale agriculture impossible. It is no exaggeration to say that the river created Egypt. Even their word for the dark soil, Kemet, became the very name of the land. The Nile was not merely a river, it was the spine and lifeblood of a nation. Floodplains, of course, are not unique to the Nile. Across the world, similar landscapes have nurtured human growth. The Ganges in India, the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Yellow River in China, all flow across wide floodplains that have been central to civilizations. Each has its quirks. The Ganges plain is vast and heavily populated, sustained by Himalayan sediments. The Tigris and Euphrates were less predictable, with floods sometimes arriving at inconvenient times, forcing early farmers to develop irrigation systems. The Yellow River carries so much fine silt, known as Lewis, that it is sometimes called China's sorrow, for while its floods enriched the land, they were also ferocious enough to sweep away entire settlements. Floodplains also shape ecosystems in ways that benefit far more than humans. Seasonal floods replenish wetlands, nourish forests, and create temporary lakes that host countless species of birds and fish. In the Pantanal of Brazil, one of the largest floodplain wetlands in the world, annual floods turn forests into underwater havens. Fish spread into the trees to feed and spawn, while birds, reptiles and mammals take advantage of the abundance. When the waters recede, nutrients remain, fueling growth until the cycle begins again. These seasonal rhythms sustain astonishing biodiversity. Deltas are the final chapter in the story of floodplains, though they deserve their own admiration. As rivers approach the sea, their flow slows dramatically, forcing them to release their sediment. Over centuries, this deposition builds land outward into the water, creating triangular or fan-shaped landscapes that can stretch for miles. The Mississippi Delta, the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta, and the Nile Delta are some of the most famous examples. Deltas are dynamic, shifting constantly as channels split and rejoin, carrying life-giving mud to new areas while abandoning others. They are natural laboratories of change, always in flux yet always fertile. Life on a floodplain is a double-edged sword. The soil is rich, the harvests abundant, but the risk of destruction always lurks. Civilizations have long sought to control their rivers with levees, channels and dams, trying to capture the benefits while avoiding the dangers. Sometimes these efforts succeed, but often they lead to unintended consequences. Artificial levees can prevent minor floods, yet make major ones more catastrophic when they eventually fail. Dams can store water for irrigation, but also starve floodplains of the very sediments they depend upon. Managing a river is like trying to tame a wild animal. You may succeed for a while, but its nature remains unchanged. Even so, humans continue to choose floodplains for settlement. More than half of the world's major cities are located on or near them. The reasons are clear: flat land, fertile soils, abundant water, and easy transportation. Yet with climate change intensifying rainfall and altering river patterns, the risks are growing. Floods that once occurred once in a century now arrive more frequently. This has made the ancient dance between rivers and floodplains more precarious, a reminder that nature's gifts often come with conditions. There is something humbling about the patience of rivers as soil makers. A single flood might bring a few centimetres of silt. hardly noticeable. But repeat that process for 1,000 years, and you have built a plain large enough to feed millions. In the Mississippi Valley, deposits from countless floods have created some of the deepest and richest soils in North America. In China, loess soils along the Yellow River stretch for vast distances, so fine and fertile that farmers can dig cave dwellings directly into them. None of this is dramatic in the moment, but across time the effect is extraordinary. The interplay of erosion and deposition makes floodplains paradoxical landscapes, at once fragile and enduring. A field may be swept away one year and replenished the next. A channel may shift across the plain, abandoning one village while enriching another. To the river, these are natural adjustments. To us, they can seem like blessings or curses. Yet without them, human history would look entirely different. No fertile floodplains, no cradles of civilization. So while floods may carry danger, they also carry renewal. Each overflow is both a challenge and a gift, both destruction and creation. Standing on a floodplain, you stand on the legacy of countless floods, each one layering its contribution to the soil beneath your feet. The land's richness is not accidental, but earned through centuries of watery labour. And perhaps that is the lesson of floodplains, that abundance often comes through cycles of loss and renewal, that what looks like chaos may in fact be a quiet system of balance. The river does not think in years or harvests, but in ages. Its floods are not accidents, but chapters in a story much older than us. From the black earth of the Nile to the wide plains of the Mississippi, the evidence is the same. Rivers are not only destroyers, they are creators. They are soil makers, life givers, and the quiet architects of the fertile fields that have nourished humanity since the beginning. At the end of a river's long journey, there is a moment of hesitation. After racing down mountains, meandering across plains, and spreading across floodplains, the river finally approaches its destination, the sea. Yet it rarely rushes straight in. Instead, as its speed slows and its burden of sediment grows heavy, the river begins to split and scatter, laying down layer after layer of mud and sand. In this way, deltas are born, those fan-shaped landscapes where water and land entwine in a final embrace. The word delta itself comes from the ancient Greeks, who noticed that the Nile's triangular spread into the Mediterranean resembled the shape of the Greek letter delta. It was a simple observation that gave a name to one of nature's most remarkable landforms. Today, deltas are found on coastlines around the globe, each a patchwork of channels, marshes and islands, built not by tectonic upheaval or volcanic fire, but by the slow work of water carrying earth to the edge of the sea. Deltas form because rivers, upon reaching flatter ground at the coast, lose the energy to carry all their sediment. What once tumbled easily in swift current now settles out grain by grain. At first, the deposits raise the riverbed, causing the river to split into smaller distributaries, channels that fan outward like veins. Each distributary seeks the easiest path to the sea, but as they too clog with silt, the river constantly rearranges its routes. The result is a landscape that is never fixed, always shifting, a living geography of water and mud. The Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta is the largest in the world, sprawling across Bangladesh and eastern India. Here two mighty rivers, fed by the snows of the Himalayas, merge into a labyrinth of waterways before meeting the Bay of Bengal. This delta sustains over 150 million people, providing fertile soils for rice cultivation and rich fisheries in its waters. It is also home to the Sundarbans, the vast mangrove forest that shelters Bengal tigers and countless other species. Yet the delta is fragile, vulnerable to cyclones, sea level rise, and the sheer weight of its human population. To live there is to live in partnership with a landscape that offers abundance but demands resilience. Far away, in North America, the Mississippi Delta tells a different story. For thousands of years, the river built new land into the Gulf of Mexico, depositing silt washed down from half a continent. The result was a deltic plain of swamps, bayous, and fertile farmland. cities like New Orleans rose upon this shifting ground, relying on the river's gifts. But in recent centuries, levees and dams upstream have trapped much of the sediment that once nourished the delta. Without its steady supply of new mud, the land is sinking and retreating under the pressure of the sea. Each year, Louisiana loses wetlands the size of a small city, a reminder that deltas are not permanent but depend on the continued flow of sediment. The Nile Delta, perhaps the most famous of all, is a landscape both ancient and modern. For millennia, it fed Egyptian civilization with rich soils laid down by annual floods. Its triangular fan, spreading into the Mediterranean, was the breadbasket of the ancient world. Today, it remains vital, sustaining tens of millions of people. But the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 20th century altered this balance. By trapping sediment in its reservoir, the dam stopped the natural rebuilding of the delta. Coastal erosion increased, and the fertile soils once renewed by floods now rely on artificial fertilizers. What had been a self-sustaining system for thousands of years shifted into a fragile equilibrium managed by human hands. Beyond these famous examples, deltas dot coastlines worldwide, the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, with its vast rice paddies, feeds a significant portion of the country's population. The Okavango Delta in Botswana is an inland delta, where a river vanishes into the sands of the Kalahari Desert, creating a seasonal oasis for wildlife rather than reaching the sea. The Lena Delta in Siberia spreads into the Arctic Ocean, one of the largest protected wilderness areas on Earth, teeming with migratory birds during the brief summer. Each delta is unique, shaped by its climate, geology, and the needs of those who live upon it. What unites them all is their role as ecological and human powerhouses. The combination of fresh water, salt water, and sediment creates habitats of extraordinary productivity. Marshes, mudflats, and estuaries support fish nurseries, bird colonies, and plant life that filters and cleans water. For humans, deltas offer farmland of unrivaled fertility and access to the sea for trade. Little wonder so many dense populations are found in these regions. They are places of abundance, though often precariously balanced on the edge of flood and storm. The drama of sedimentation is not loud, but it is profound. Picture a river carrying billions of tiny particles eroded from mountains, hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Every flood, every storm, every season adds another layer. Over centuries, those layers stack into deltas visible from space, land literally built from the dust of distant hills. To walk across a delta is to tread on the memory of mountains, transported grain by grain across the land. And yet, as resilient as they appear, deltas are among the most vulnerable landscapes in the world. Rising seas threaten to drown them. Dams cut off their supply of replenishing sediment. Urban development paves over their wetlands, reducing their ability to absorb floods. Climate change brings stronger storms and surges. In this sense, deltas are like balancing acts, rich but fragile, abundant yet exposed. Their survival depends on the careful balance between river and sea, between human need and natural rhythm. Still, there is poetry in their persistence. Despite challenges, deltas continue to support life on a scale unmatched by most ecosystems. They remind us that rivers do not end abruptly when they meet the sea. Instead, they leave one final gift, spreading their energy and their earth into landscapes that sustain both people and nature. So the next time you see a map of a river reaching the ocean, look closely at the widening shape at its mouth. That fan of channels, that lacework of water and land, is more than a geographical curiosity. It is the culmination of a journey thousands of miles long. It is the evidence of patience, of countless floods carrying countless grains, of a river's last act of creation before it merges with the sea. And in that quiet meeting place, where fresh water softens into salt, entire worlds of life unfold. Every river has its own personality, but some stand apart by sheer scale, history, or influence. They are the waterways that appear on schoolroom maps, the ones poets write about, and the ones satellites capture in sweeping arcs from space. These great rivers are not just channels of water, they are forces that have shaped continents, cultures, and ecosystems. To travel them in thought is to embark on a world tour guided by the flow of water. The Amazon in South America is the undisputed giant. By volume of discharge, no other river comes close. On average, it releases more than 200,000 cubic meters of water into the Atlantic Ocean every second, enough to fill countless Olympic swimming pools in the blink of an eye. The Amazon basin covers an area larger than the entire European Union, draining rain that falls across 9 different countries. Its breadth is so immense that in the rainy season the river can swell to more than 30 miles wide in places, turning islands into hilltops and forests into vast temporary seas. But the Amazon is not simply a river of statistics, it is a lifeline to one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth. Within its waters swim pink river dolphins, piranhas, and catfish the size of small cars. Its banks are home to jaguars, macaques, and countless species of insects and plants. The river serves as the main highway for people living in the basin, where roads are few and forests stretch for endless miles. Boats, from dugout canoes to massive barges, carry people, goods, and stories along its course. It is a river of abundance and mystery, one that feels more like an ocean flowing through a forest than a simple waterway. If the Amazon is the giant of flow, the Nile is the monarch of history. Stretching more than 4,000 miles across Africa, it has long claimed the title of the world's longest river. Rising from headwaters in Burundi and Uganda, it journeys northward through Sudan and Egypt before surrendering to the Mediterranean. The Nile is unusual in that it flows through some of the driest landscapes on the planet. Its valley cuts a ribbon of green across the Sahara, a stark contrast visible even from space. For thousands of years, the Nile was the foundation of Egyptian civilization. Its predictable floods brought fertile silt, ensuring harvests that supported one of the world's earliest empires. Temples, cities, and pyramids rose along its banks, while its waters carried goods and armies. Even today, more than 90% of Egypt's population lives within a few miles of the river. The Nile is not simply a geographical feature. It is a cultural identity, a thread that ties together millennia of history. Its waters have witnessed pharaohs, merchants, poets, and modern capitals, each adding their chapter to its ongoing story. Across the globe in Asia, the Yangtze reigns as China's great river. At more than 3,900 miles, it rivals the Nile in length, and it surpasses every river except the Amazon in volume. The Yangtze begins on the Tibetan Plateau, where glaciers melt into streams that gather strength as they descend through mountains and gorges. It then winds its way across the heart of China, passing through some of the most densely populated regions on Earth before reaching the East China Sea near Shanghai. The Yangtze is both natural wonder and economic powerhouse. Its basin is home to nearly 1/3 of China's population. For centuries, it has been a corridor of culture, linking diverse regions and supporting rice agriculture on its fertile plains. In modern times, it hosts some of the largest engineering projects in the world, including the colossal Three Gorges Dam. This dam provides hydroelectric power, flood control and navigation improvements, but it has also displaced millions of people and submerged historic sites. The Yangtze embodies both the potential and the challenges of humanity's relationship with rivers, vital, powerful, and deeply intertwined with human ambition. Travelling back to the Americas, the Mississippi presents a different character altogether. Known as the Father of Waters, it flows for more than 2,300 miles from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico, draining a basin that covers over 40% of the continental United States. Along the way, it gathers countless tributaries, including the Missouri and the Ohio, weaving together the geography of a nation. The Mississippi has been central to American history and identity. indigenous peoples used it for trade and sustenance long before European explorers arrived. Later, it became the backbone of commerce, carrying cotton, timber, and grain from the interior to the sea. Its steamboats are immortalized in the writings of Mark Twain, who captured the river's restless spirit and its power to shape communities. Even today, barges filled with goods ply its waters, underscoring its role as a living artery of trade. The Mississippi is a river of contrasts, peaceful in its wide, slow stretches, yet capable of fierce floods that reshape its course and overwhelm entire towns. In Europe, the Danube offers a different kind of greatness. Though not the longest river on the continent, it is perhaps the most cosmopolitan. Rising in Germany's Black Forest, it winds its way through or along the borders of 10 countries before emptying into the Black Sea. No other river in the world flows through as many nations, making the Danube a truly international waterway. The Danube has been a cultural crossroads for millennia. It was a frontier of the Roman Empire, a trade route through the Middle Ages, and a symbol in music and poetry. Johann Strauss's waltz, The Blue Danube, gave the river a romantic image that endures to this day. Its waters link cities such as Vienna, Budapest, and Belgrade, each with its own story to tell. The river's delta, rich with wetlands and wildlife, is one of Europe's greatest natural treasures, a sanctuary for birds and fish at the edge of the sea. Comparing these rivers is a reminder of how varied their greatness can be. The Amazon's claim is scale and wildness, carrying more water than the next several rivers combined. The Nile's strength lies in its history, a river that carves civilization into a desert. The Yangtze embodies human ambition, blending natural might with engineering feats. The Mississippi represents connection, uniting a vast land through trade and culture. The Danube is a river of bridges, linking peoples, languages, and traditions across an entire continent. Yet despite their differences, they all share the same essence. They are moving water shaped by gravity, carving land and carrying life. Each began as trickles in distant hills and grew through countless convergences. Each has known floods and droughts, triumphs and disasters. They remind us that rivers, no matter how grand, are part of the same patient system that begins with a single raindrop. To journey among the world's great rivers is to see how deeply they are woven into the human story. They are not only physical features on a map, but living presences, shaping languages, economies, and imaginations. They are highways and borders, sources of nourishment and inspiration, and like the currents they carry, their influence spreads outward, reaching far beyond their banks. Perhaps the truest measure of a river's greatness is not in its length or discharge, but in the depth of its connection with the world around it. By that measure, each of these rivers, the Amazon, the Nile, the Yangtze, the Mississippi and the Danube, is immeasurably great. Together they form a chorus of flowing water, each voice distinct, yet all singing the same quiet song of persistence, patience, and life. Civilizations are often born where water lingers. The phrase, cradle of civilization, is no accident, and it is striking how many of those cradles are damp. Rivers provided not only water to drink, but also fertile soils, natural highways, and a steady rhythm that allowed human communities to move from hunting and gathering to farming and building. Without rivers, the world's first cities might never have emerged, and our shared history might look very different. In Mesopotamia, often described as the very first cradle, two great rivers shape the destiny of an entire region. The Tigris and Euphrates rise in the mountains of modern Turkey and flow south through Iraq into the Persian Gulf. Between them lies a broad alluvial plain where their floods once deposited rich soils. Around 6,000 years ago, people settled here in increasing numbers, planting wheat and barley, domesticating animals, and constructing irrigation channels to guide the waters where they were needed most. This was the land of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria. a patchwork of kingdoms and city-states whose stories echo through ancient tablets and epics. Mesopotamian life was inseparable from the rivers. Canals and levees formed the veins of the earliest irrigation systems, enabling farmers to grow surplus food. That surplus supported specialists, priests, scribes, merchants, and kings. Clay tablets baked in the sun record grain tallies, contracts, and myths. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest surviving works of literature, describes floods, journeys across rivers, and the anxieties of a people whose lives were bound to the unpredictable moods of water. Floods could nourish, but they could also destroy. Unlike the Nile, whose inundation was relatively predictable, the Tigris and Euphrates sometimes rose without warning, sweeping away fields and villages. This unpredictability may be one reason Mesopotamian religion often emphasized appeasing restless gods. To the west along the Nile, another civilization flourished with water as its foundation. Egypt is sometimes called the gift of the Nile, a phrase used by the historian Herodotus more than 2,000 years ago. Without the river, the surrounding land is nearly all desert. But each summer, like clockwork, the Nile rose as rains fell in distant highlands. When the waters receded months later, they left behind a coating of rich, black silt that allowed crops to flourish. Wheat and barley grew in abundance, supporting a population that could dedicate itself to building temples, pyramids, and cities along the river's edge. The Nile was more than a source of food. It was also a highway, carrying boats laden with stone, timber, and grain up and down its length. Communication along the river unified the land, enabling pharaohs to rule over territories stretching hundreds of miles. Religious life was likewise tied to the waters. The inundation was seen as a divine blessing, the tears of the goddess Isis or the lifeblood of Osiris. Festivals marked its arrival, and the calendar itself was structured around the cycle of flood, planting, and harvest. Unlike the volatile rivers of Mesopotamia, the Nile's steady rhythm encouraged a sense of order and permanence. Perhaps that is why Egyptian civilization, with its monuments and hieroglyphs, projected such stability across thousands of years. Farther east, the Indus Valley nurtured another great civilization. Centered along the Indus River and its tributaries in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, this culture thrived from around 3,000 to 1,500 years before the Common Era. The Indus carried glacial meltwater from the Himalayas, flooding regularly and leaving behind fertile soil across a broad plain. Archaeological discoveries at cities such as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro reveal well-planned streets, advanced drainage systems, and standardized weights and measures. This suggests a highly organized society, supported by the agricultural wealth of the river valley. The Indus Valley civilization remains somewhat mysterious because its script has not yet been fully deciphered. But we know that trade flourished, linking the region with Mesopotamia and beyond. The river itself provided both the means of transport and the sustenance for farming. Over time, however, shifts in river courses and perhaps changes in climate contributed to the decline of this early urban society. Even so, its legacy endures in the cultural memory of South Asia, where rivers continue to hold sacred status. China too saw the rise of civilization along its great waterways. Two rivers dominate the story: the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze in the south. The Yellow River, or Huanghe, is often called the Mother River of China, for it nourished the earliest dynasties, including the Xia and Shang. Its fertile soils, derived from fine low sediment blown in from Central Asia, allowed farming communities to thrive. Yet the river's gifts came with peril. The Yellow River floods were both frequent and catastrophic, earning it another name, China's Sorrow. Entire regions could be submerged, and shifting channels sometimes forced whole populations to relocate. Despite the risks, the rich farmland along its banks made settlement irresistible. The Yangtze, farther south, supported rice cultivation in wetter climates. Over centuries, its valley became the breadbasket of China, producing enough surplus to sustain large populations and complex societies. The combination of these two river systems allowed Chinese civilization to expand, diversify and endure across millennia. Even today, both rivers remain central to the country's identity, economy and culture. It is striking how often rivers appear in humanity's earlier stories. They were not just practical necessities, but symbols of life, fertility and renewal. Floods were interpreted as divine anger or blessing. Riverbanks became sacred sites, hosting temples, shrines and rituals. Myths told of heroes crossing dangerous currents, or gods controlling the waters. For people living thousands of years ago, rivers were not abstract features of geography. They were living presences, unpredictable yet indispensable. The phrase "cradle of civilization" is therefore almost always wet because water was the indispensable ingredient for settled life. In dry landscapes, rivers provided the difference between desert and garden. In fertile plains, they gave the abundance needed to support towns and cities. Without rivers, farming would have been far more precarious, transport more difficult, and trade more limited. The clustering of early civilizations along river valleys is no coincidence. It is the natural outcome of humanity's need for dependable water. But rivers did more than support farming. They connected people. Canoes and boats allowed goods, ideas, and cultures to move along their courses. Rivers acted as natural highways in a world before paved roads, linking villages and cities into broader networks. They were also boundaries and frontiers, marking divisions between peoples, while simultaneously inviting exchange across their currents. In reflecting on Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus, and China, one sees a common pattern: human ingenuity working with the rhythms of water. Irrigation channels, canals, levees, and reservoirs were among humanity's earliest engineering projects, born from the need to manage rivers. These works represent not only technical skill, but also the beginnings of organized governance, for such projects required cooperation and planning on a large scale. It is no exaggeration to say that the rise of government itself is tied to the management of rivers. The story of rivers and civilizations is in the end a story of partnership. People learned to read the seasons of water, to plant when floods receded, to harvest before the next inundation. They honoured the rivers with myths and rituals, feared them when they raged, and relied on them every day. The world's first cities rose not in isolation, but along banks of flowing water. Civilization's cradle, in other words, was not a rocking chair of stone and wood, but a current of fresh water carrying humanity into a new way of life. Throughout human history, rivers have been more than physical streams of water. They have been spiritual currents, woven into the myths, religions, and imaginations of countless cultures. To stand on the banks of a river is to feel something more than the flow of water. It is to sense continuity, renewal, and the mysteries of life itself. Some rivers have become so deeply sacred that they shape not only landscapes, but entire civilizations' understanding of the divine. The Ganges is perhaps the most famous sacred river in the world. Flowing more than 1,500 miles from the Himalayas to the Bay of Bengal, it is revered in Hinduism as the goddess Ganga. According to tradition, she descended from heaven to earth to purify humankind, her waters carrying the promise of cleansing and liberation. Pilgrims journey from across India and beyond to bathe in her waters, seeking absolution from sin and the blessing of spiritual renewal. The Ganges is not just a river to its devotees, it is a cosmic being, a bridge between the earthly and the eternal. Rituals take place at her ghats, the stepped river fronts found in cities such as Varanasi, where flames flicker in evening ceremonies and chants rise with the mist. Ashes of the dead are scattered into the current, in the belief that the Ganges grants moksha, release from the cycle of rebirth. To an outside observer, it may appear as a busy, bustling river, but to millions it is the embodiment of grace, a living deity flowing through daily life. The reverence is so strong that even pollution cannot erase its sanctity in the minds of believers. Despite modern challenges, industrial waste, sewage, plastic, the faith in her purifying power endures. Science might test water samples and list contaminants, but in the cultural imagination, the river remains pure. This tension between physical reality and symbolic meaning is what makes sacred rivers so fascinating. They are both natural bodies and spiritual beings, operating on two levels at once. In the Middle East, the Jordan River holds a different but equally powerful significance. Though it is modest in size compared to the Ganges or Nile, its symbolic weight is immense. The Jordan flows from the mountains of Lebanon down through the Sea of Galilee and into the Dead Sea, threading its way through lands central to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It appears again and again in sacred texts, often as a boundary, a line that separates one stage of a people's journey from the next. For the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible, crossing the Jordan marked the passage into the Promised Land. In Christian tradition, the Jordan became the site where John the Baptist immersed Jesus, transforming the river into a symbol of renewal and spiritual rebirth. To this day, pilgrims come to its banks to undergo baptism in its waters, tracing a ritual lineage that has endured for centuries. For Muslims too, the river valley is part of a holy geography, a landscape connected to prophets and sacred history. The Jordan illustrates how rivers often serve as thresholds. They are liminal places, neither holy land nor sea, always in motion. To step into a river is to cross from one state to another, whether from wilderness into homeland, from sin into forgiveness, or from life into afterlife. The physical act of crossing water becomes a metaphor for transformation, something deeply embedded in cultures around the world. Then there is the Nile, whose cultural role was not only practical but profoundly symbolic. For ancient Egyptians, the river was more than their means of survival. It was a divine presence. They believed the god Hapi controlled the annual floods, bringing nourishment to the land. The inundation was not just a natural cycle, but a sacred event, celebrated with festivals and offerings. The dark silt left behind after the waters retreated was seen as the river's gift, the very flesh of the god Osiris, who represented death and resurrection. Egyptian mythology wove the Nile into its cosmic order. The river's steady rise and fall mirrored the cycles of life and death, reinforcing the belief that existence itself followed a rhythmic balance. Temples were aligned with its course, tombs built on its banks. To sail the Nile was to journey not only through space, but also through layers of myth and symbolism. Even today, the Nile retains this aura. Though modern Egypt relies on dams and irrigation, the ancient association between the river and renewal still lingers in its cultural identity. Sacred rivers are not confined to these three examples. In many cultures, watercourses hold divine significance. The Yamuna in India, sister to the Ganges, is also worshipped as a goddess. The Volga in Russia has been venerated in folklore and songs as the mother river of the Russian people. In Africa, rivers such as the Niger are bound to creation stories and spiritual practices. In Native American traditions, rivers often appear as life-giving spirits or pathways for souls. The universality of these beliefs suggests that humans everywhere sensed in rivers something beyond their physical reality, a flowing mystery, a presence larger than themselves. One reason rivers carry such symbolic weight is their role in renewal. They're in constant motion, always flowing, always changing, yet always present. You can never step into the same river twice, as the Greek philosopher Heraclitus famously observed, because the water that touched your skin a moment ago is already gone. This quality of change within continuity makes rivers perfect symbols for life, death, and rebirth. They embody both permanence and impermanence, qualities that religions often try to explain. Rivers also link heavens and earth. They fall from clouds as rain or snow, flow across the land, and eventually merge with the sea, a cycle that seems almost cosmic in its pattern. To ancient observers, this cycle suggested divine order. Rivers rise mysteriously from mountains, the dwelling places of gods, and journey down to the ocean, often imagined as the source of all creation. In following this path, rivers seem to mirror the soul's journey from origin to return. There is also something deeply communal about sacred rivers. They bring people together, not just physically but spiritually. Pilgrims gathering at the Ganges, worshippers at the Jordan, or celebrants along the Nile all share in rituals that transcend individual life. The river becomes a meeting place between the earthly and the eternal, a common thread binding generations. Even when modern pressures intrude, pollution, dams, climate change, the symbolic bond remains unbroken, a reminder of the deep human need for meaning in the flowing of water. What is striking is how these stories reveal the dual identity of rivers. They are at once utterly practical, providing drinking water, irrigation, and transport, and profoundly symbolic, carrying the weight of myth and hope. A river may be muddy, unpredictable, or even dangerous, yet it is also revered as holy. This tension is part of their enduring power. People depend on rivers physically, and they turn to them spiritually. The same current that fills a cup of water can also carry prayers, blessings, and dreams. So when we speak of sacred rivers, we are not only describing geography, we are speaking of human imagination flowing alongside natural currents. The Ganges, the Jordan, the Nile. These rivers do more than connect mountains to seas. They connect humans to the divine, linking the practical with the poetic, the earthly with the eternal. They remind us that water, so ordinary and necessary, can also be extraordinary, a sacred mirror in which humanity sees both its fragility and its longing for the infinite. Long before humans carved roads through forests or laid rails across continents, rivers were the original highways. They stretched across landscapes ready-made, requiring no paving, no surveying, and no construction crews. Gravity did the work of pulling water downhill, and people quickly learned that if the river was moving, they could move with it. To travel along a river was to hitch a ride with nature itself, letting the current carry you forward faster and farther than your legs ever could on land. For small communities, the first vehicles were the simplest: logs bound together into rafts, hollowed tree trunks shaped into canoes, or bundles of reeds tied tightly enough to float. Archaeologists have found evidence of dugout canoes more than 10,000 years old, carved painstakingly with stone tools. These early watercraft were modest in design but revolutionary in purpose. A canoe transformed a slow walk along a muddy bank into swift passage across lakes and rivers. Fishing became easier, trade routes longer, and journeys more adventurous. Different cultures adapted rivers with remarkable ingenuity. In North America, indigenous peoples developed sleek birch bark canoes, light enough to carry over land between rivers yet strong enough to handle rapids. On the Amazon, people crafted boats from palm wood and tree resin suited to the tangled waterways of the rainforest. On the Nile, reed boats floated cargo and passengers long before pharaohs built their stone temples. The principle was universal. Wherever water flowed, humans found a way to ride it. Rivers soon became conduits for trade. Imagine a farmer with surplus grain or fish. On foot, he might feed his village and perhaps the next one down the road. With a raft, he could send his goods dozens of miles away, letting the current deliver them. A river turned local abundance into regional exchange. Salt, obsidian, pottery, and cloth travelled along watery corridors, carrying not just objects but also ideas. Civilizations developed distinctive identities, yet rivers connected them into wider worlds. In Mesopotamia, barges floated along the Euphrates loaded with dates, wool, and copper. In China, junks and sampans carried silk and rice along the Yangtze and its tributaries. In Europe, the Danube and Rhine became commercial lifelines, drawing merchants and towns to their banks. Rivers were not only natural boundaries but also bridges, joining distant peoples in webs of exchange. Exploration, too, often followed rivers. For early adventurers, a river was both a map and a path. Follow it upstream, and you reached unknown mountains. Follow it downstream, and you found seas and distant coasts. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, described expeditions up the Nile, piecing together the geography of Africa. Centuries later, European explorers traced the Amazon, the Congo, and the Mississippi in their quests for trade, conquest, or sheer curiosity. These journeys were rarely easy. Rapids, waterfalls, and seasonal floods made rivers unpredictable. Yet despite the hazards, rivers remained irresistible guides into the heart of continents. Not all river travel was peaceful. Viking longships remind us that rivers were also avenues of invasion. With their shallow drafts, these sleek wooden vessels could sail both on open seas and deep into river systems. From the 9th to the 11th centuries, Norse raiders used rivers like the Seine, the Thames, and the Volga as pathways to strike at inland towns and monasteries. To communities unprepared for such swift attacks, rivers that once seemed lifelines suddenly became entry points for danger. Still, these same rivers later carried trade goods and settlers as the Vikings shifted from raiding to colonizing. The dual nature of rivers, as channels of prosperity and peril, was once again revealed. The geography of rivers often shaped the geography of settlements. Towns grew where rivers were navigable, where boats could dock, and where trade could flourish. Paris began along the Seine, London on the Thames, Baghdad on the Tigris, and countless other cities arose where rivers made movement easier. Bridges, quays, and harbours turned natural flow into organised commerce. Even today, many of the world's largest cities owe their locations to rivers, chosen not for their views but for their utility as highways of water. Rivers also served as postal routes of a sort, carrying not only goods but messages. In some regions, communication relied on floating sealed gourds or bundles of reeds containing messages downstream. Elsewhere, oral messengers used boats to travel quickly between communities. Information spread with the flow of water, just as goods did. A rumour launched upstream might reach the sea in a matter of days if the river was fast enough. There is a kind of elegance in the way rivers solve so many logistical problems. Carrying heavy loads over land is exhausting, but let the river do the work and the problem vanishes. Barges laden with timber, stone, or grain could drift downstream with ease, needing only steering. Upstream travel was harder, requiring poles, sails, or later towpaths, where animals or people hauled boats against the current. But even that was easier than dragging the same cargo by cart over rough ground. Rivers multiplied human effort, turning small villages into trading networks and networks into civilizations. In more recent centuries, human engineering has refined river travel. Locks and canals expanded the reach of navigable waterways. Barges plied Europe's rivers and canals, carrying coal, iron, and textiles during the Industrial Revolution. Steam power in the 19th century transformed rivers like the Mississippi, where steamboats stacked high with cargo and passengers became icons of a new era. Mark Twain immortalized their whistles and bustling decks, capturing a period when the river was the beating heart of commerce and culture. Yet even as roads and railways spread, rivers never lost their role. Barges on the Rhine still carry goods today, just as they did in Roman times. Container ships sail up the Yangtze to reach inland cities hundreds of miles from the coast. On the Amazon, where the rainforest makes road building difficult, rivers remain the main transport routes for both people and products. Far from being outdated, rivers continue to prove their usefulness as highways that cost nothing to build and little to maintain. Perhaps what makes rivers most remarkable as highways is their universality. Every continent has its stories of boats and barges, traders and travellers. Whether it was a reed raft drifting along the Nile, a birch-bark canoe slicing across a Canadian lake, or a longship gliding silently up a European estuary, the principle was the same. Water makes movement easier. Rivers shrank the world long before wheels or engines did. And there is something poetic in that. While asphalt roads now crisscross the globe, they're relatively recent intrusions. Rivers have always been there, waiting, flowing, offering their currents to anyone willing to launch a vessel. They remind us that human mobility has always depended as much on cooperation with nature as on conquering it. The current pulls, the boat floats, and suddenly horizons expand. So the next time you see a river winding its way across a landscape, remember that it is not only a natural feature, it is also a road, one that carried the dreams, the ambitions, and the stories of countless generations. Long before cars and airplanes, before highways and airports, rivers were the original connectors, stitching together distant lands with nothing more than water's steady flow. Cities are rarely placed at random. Behind the bustle of markets, the sprawl of streets, and the rise of monuments, there is often a quiet geographic reason why people settled in one spot and not another. Again and again, rivers provide that reason. They offer water to drink, soil to farm, routes to travel, and defences to rely upon. It is no surprise, then, that many of the world's most iconic cities owe their very existence to the rivers that run through them. Take Paris, a city whose romance and elegance often distract from its practical foundations. Long before the Eiffel Tower, Notre Dame, or Café Terraces, there was the Seine. The earlier settlers chose the small island now known as Île de la Cité because it offered natural protection, with water on all sides. From this modest beginning, the city expanded outward along the riverbanks, each generation building bridges, quays, and boulevards. The Seine became not just a feature but a framework. It supplied fish for food, allowed the transport of stone and timber, and connected Paris to the rest of France. Even today, the river defines the city's geography. The distinction between the right bank and the left bank is more than a matter of compass points. It has shaped culture, identity, and history. Poets wrote about it, artists painted it, and lovers continue to stroll along it, all because of a river that once gave a small settlement its reason for being. London tells a similar story, though with its own twists. The Thames was the stage on which the city's destiny was set. In Roman times, the river provided a natural crossing point, a place where it was narrow enough to bridge yet deep enough for ships. Londinium, as the Romans called it, grew rapidly around this strategic site. Over centuries, the Thames served as a bustling waterway, carrying goods from across the empire and later across the globe. Coal, grain, spices and textiles flowed in, while finished products and ideas flowed out. The river was a lifeline of commerce, but it was also a line of defence. When invaders threatened, the Thames acted as both barrier and refuge. As London expanded, the river continued to shape it. Bridges multiplied, docks sprawled, and the banks filled with warehouses, palaces, and eventually the grand institutions of empire. The Thames gave London its power, but also its challenges. It flooded, froze, and at times reeked with pollution. The infamous Great Stink of 1858, when hot weather amplified the smell of untreated sewage, spurred Parliament to modernise the city's sanitation. In this way, the Thames was both benefactor and disciplinarian, rewarding the city with prosperity, but reminding it to treat the river with respect. Today, its embankments and skyline tell a story that begins with a simple bend in a river and culminates in one of the world's great capitals. Cairo rises along the Nile, and here the link between river and city is impossible to miss. The Nile did not merely influence Cairo, it made it possible. Surrounded by desert, Egypt's capital could never have thrived without the steady flow of the river. Ancient settlements appeared here as natural stopping points along the waterway, places where goods and people could be exchanged. When Islamic rulers established Cairo in the 10th century, the Nile's centrality was unquestioned. It supplied water for drinking and irrigation, nourished crops, and connected the city to both Upper and Lower Egypt. Cairo's identity is inseparable from the Nile's rhythm. For centuries, its annual floods determined the agricultural calendar, dictating when farmers planted and harvested. Markets in Cairo thrived because the river delivered grain, papyrus, and goods from upriver. Mosques, palaces, and neighbourhoods grew along the banks, always within reach of the life-giving water. Even in modern times, with dams regulating the flow, the Nile remains central. To stand on one of Cairo's bridges at sunset and watch the boats drift by is to glimpse a continuum that stretches back thousands of years. The skyline may change, but the river remains the spine of the city. Far to the east, Shanghai tells a different kind of river story. Its rise to prominence is tied to the Yangtze, the longest river in Asia and one of the most important in the world. The Yangtze's estuary provided Shanghai with access to the rich hinterlands of central China, while also opening to the East China Sea. This unique position turned it into a gateway between inland and overseas trade. By the 19th century, Shanghai had become a global hub, its wharves crowded with ships carrying tea, silk and porcelain outward, and foreign goods inward. The Huangpu River, a tributary of the Yangtze, flows directly through Shanghai, dividing it into districts that mirror the city's layered history. On one side lies the Bund, a stretch of colonial-era architecture that once symbolized foreign presence. On the other, modern skyscrapers rise in Pudong, testaments to China's rapid economic transformation. The river between them serves as both divider and connector, a liquid stage on which Shanghai's past and future face each other. Without the Yangtze and its channels, Shanghai might have remained a modest fishing village. Instead, it grew into one of the world's busiest ports, proof of how rivers can propel cities into global prominence. What unites these cities, Paris, London, Cairo, Shanghai, is the way rivers offered opportunity and shaped identity. Settlers were drawn by the basics: water to drink, fish to eat, fertile land to cultivate, and a route to travel. But over time, the rivers gave much more. They became symbols, cultural markers, and central characters in the stories of their cities. Paris without the Seine would lose its left and right banks. London without the Thames would lack its docks and its bridge-filled silhouette. Cairo without the Nile would not exist at all. Shanghai without the Yangtze would be unrecognisable, stripped of its role as gateway to China. Of course, rivers also demanded compromise. Floods had to be managed, banks reinforced, and pollution addressed. But these challenges did not diminish the bond. They deepened it. The struggles became part of the city's histories, shaping their resilience and ingenuity. When you walk along the embankments of these river cities, you're not simply strolling by water. You're following the footsteps of countless generations who fetched water, loaded cargo, cast fishing nets, or leaned on bridges to watch the current. The river is not a backdrop but a participant, always flowing, always shaping, always present. It is the quiet partner in the grand drama of urban life. So the next time you think of a city skyline, remember that beneath the towers and monuments often lies a river, flowing steadily as it has for centuries. These rivers are the hidden architects of human settlement, the original city planners who laid out routes long before stone or steel. They remind us that human achievement is often built on a foundation carved by water, and that the heart of a city may not be a building at all, but a current flowing endlessly past its banks. A river is both a gift and an obstacle. It brings water, food, and fertile soil, but it also interrupts a traveller's path. For as long as humans have walked along riverbanks, they have wondered how best to cross to the other side. Over time, those solutions evolved from the simplest of stepping stones to soaring spans of steel and cable that seem to defy gravity. To trace the story of bridges and crossings is to take a gentle walk through human history, guided always by the flowing presence of rivers. The earliest crossings were the most straightforward. In shallow stretches, people placed large stones in a line, creating a path across the current. These stepping stones appear in folklore and legend as much as archaeology. Children still hop across them today, turning geography into a playful challenge. Elsewhere, fallen trees provided natural footbridges, inviting passage from one bank to the other. These primitive solutions were not permanent, but they served their purpose. For a long time, humans did not need anything more elaborate. As societies grew and trade expanded, the need for more reliable crossings became clear. The first true bridges were likely simple wooden structures, beams laid across supports driven into the riverbed. Some of these early designs were surprisingly durable. Ancient Chinese builders, for instance, crafted beam bridges from massive timbers bound together, able to carry carts and animals across busy routes. In other parts of the world, rope bridges stretched over deep gorges, swaying alarmingly but holding firm enough for the people who trusted them. The Romans, however, elevated bridge building to an art of both engineering and empire. Determined to link their far-flung territories, they built roads that spanned rivers with stone bridges of extraordinary strength. Using the arch, a design that distributes weight evenly, they created structures that still stand 2,000 years later. The Pont de Gare in southern France, though technically an aqueduct, doubled as a crossing and remains one of the most striking testaments to Roman ingenuity. Their bridges were practical but also symbolic, permanent declarations that Rome's reach was unbroken by obstacles of water. Soldiers, merchants, and travellers all benefited from these durable spans. In the Middle Ages, bridges acquired new layers of meaning. They were not just passageways, but communities in themselves. Many medieval bridges were lined with chapels, shops, and houses. London Bridge, in its earliest versions, bustled with dwellings and businesses perched precariously above the Thames. Crossing such a bridge was less like walking across a span and more like entering a small town suspended above water. Religious institutions often sponsored bridge construction, seeing them as acts of charity and piety. To help a traveller cross safely was to perform a good deed. Some bridge chapels still survive, quiet reminders of a time when rivers were as much spiritual boundaries as physical ones. Medieval builders also perfected the use of stone arches, creating spans of elegance as well as strength. The Charles Bridge in Prague, adorned with statues of saints, became both a vital crossing and a place of ceremony. In Florence, the Ponte Vecchio grew into a lively street of jewellers and merchants. These bridges fused function with culture, becoming central landmarks of their cities. They were places where people lingered, traded, prayed, and celebrated, not just hurried across. As centuries passed and engineering knowledge expanded, bridges began to take on forms that seemed increasingly ambitious. The Industrial Revolution spurred a leap forward in materials, introducing iron and later steel. Suddenly, spans could stretch farther and bear heavier loads. The Iron Bridge in Shropshire, built in the late 18th century, was the first of its kind and remains a symbol of the age of invention. It opened the way for railway bridges that linked entire nations, their trusses and girders carrying trains across landscapes at speeds once unimaginable. Suspension bridges followed, introducing designs that married strength with grace. By hanging roadways from cables anchored in massive towers, engineers could cross previously unthinkable distances. The Brooklyn Bridge in New York, completed in the 19th century, became an instant icon, a blend of stone towers and steel wires that symbolized modern progress. The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, with its sweeping red span across the bay, later captured the imagination of the world. These bridges were not merely crossings, but monuments, statements of confidence in human ability to master nature's obstacles. At the same time, smaller and humbler bridges continued to play their quiet roles. In rural villages, stone footbridges arched gracefully over streams, blending into the landscape as if they had grown there. Covered wooden bridges, common in parts of Europe and North America, protected their timbers from the weather and became romantic symbols of countryside charm. Each culture left its own imprint on bridge design, from Japan's delicate arched garden bridges to the vast viaducts of Europe's railways. In the modern era, bridge building has reached astonishing levels of ambition. Cable-stayed designs stretch across vast estuaries, their lines as elegant as harp strings. The Millau Viaduct in France soars above the Tarn Valley, taller than the Eiffel Tower and often shrouded in mist like a bridge into the clouds. In China, some of the longest and highest bridges in the world span gorges and deltas, reflecting the continuing importance of rivers and waterways in human connectivity. These structures are marvels of calculation and material science, yet they retain the same purpose as stepping stones, to carry people safely across flowing water. Bridges have always been more than engineering feats. They are metaphors, symbols of connection and unity. To bridge a divide is to overcome differences. To burn a bridge is to cut off possibility. Even in language, bridges embody the human desire to connect what is separated. They represent trust that a structure will hold, trust that one can step forward and arrive safely on the other side. Crossing a bridge is also an experience. One feels the sway of a rope bridge in the wind, the cool shadow under a medieval arch, the thrilling openness of a suspension bridge high above the water. Each crossing carries a sense of journey, a moment between departure and arrival, and always beneath the river flows, indifferent to the structures above it yet guiding their placement. Looking back, it is remarkable how far humanity has come from stepping stones to soaring spans. Yet the impulse behind all of it is the same. A river beckons us to cross, and we find a way. In every culture, in every age, people have answered that call with ingenuity, persistence, and no small amount of daring. The result is a legacy of crossings that link not only banks, but also times, weaving together centuries of human effort into a single story that flows alongside the rivers themselves. A river is not only a ribbon of water flowing across the land, it is a living system, a habitat that teems with creatures both seen and unseen, from microscopic plankton drifting invisibly in the current to the fish, frogs and birds that rely on its flow. To peer into a river is to witness an entire world at work, a world where each ripple hides a drama and every bend supports a community. Far from being empty corridors of water, rivers are some of the richest and most dynamic ecosystems on Earth. At the heart of any river's life are its fish. They are the most visible residents, slipping between shadows and darting against the current with effortless grace. Some, like minnows, live short and simple lives in quiet backwaters, while others undertake journeys that rival epic tales. Salmon, for example, hatch in cold, gravelly streams, then travel thousands of miles downstream to spend their adult lives in the ocean, before fighting their way back upstream to the very waters of their birth. Along the way, they feed countless predators, from eagles to bears to humans. A single salmon's journey links river to sea, forest to mountain, predator to prey. Catfish, meanwhile, prefer muddy depths, some growing to lengths of several meters in rivers like the Mekong. In the Amazon, electric eels send pulses of electricity through the water, both to navigate and to stun prey. And in countless rivers across the world, carp, perch, trout and sturgeon play their parts in a delicate web of feeding, breeding and surviving. Each species fills a niche, together forming a mosaic of aquatic life. Sharing the water with fish are the amphibians, creatures whose very name means double life. Frogs, toads, salamanders and newts depend on rivers and streams for reproduction. Their eggs hatch into aquatic larvae, breathing with gills before metamorphosing into air-breathing adults that hop into forests and meadows. Amphibians are sensitive indicators of river health because their thin skin absorbs pollutants easily. When frog populations decline, it often signals that the water quality is deteriorating. Thus, they act as early warning systems, sounding alarms for entire ecosystems. Plants, too, form the quiet backbone of river life. Aquatic vegetation such as water lilies, reeds and submerged grasses provide shelter for fish, nesting spots for birds, and food for insects. Algae coat rocks in thin green films, feeding snails and grazing fish. On the banks, willows and cottonwood send their roots deep into moist soils, stabilizing banks against erosion. Their leaves fall into the current, becoming food for insects, which in turn are eaten by fish. In this way, Even a single leaf drifting downstream is part of the nutrient cycle, fueling life all along the river. Birds, perhaps more than any other creatures, reveal the abundance of rivers. Kingfishers hover before plunging beak first into the water to snatch minnows. Herons stalk patiently in the shallows, their long legs adapted for wading and their sharp beaks for spearing fish. Ducks and geese paddle in calmer stretches, dabbling for plants or invertebrates. Eagles, ospreys and pelicans rely heavily on fish, soaring above rivers with keen eyes and diving at the perfect moment to pluck a meal from the surface. Migratory birds often follow river corridors as navigational guides, resting along wetlands and floodplains that provide food and safety. The air above a river is as alive as the water itself. What ties all these creatures together is the nutrient cycle, the invisible machinery that keeps rivers productive. Nutrients enter rivers from the land, from soil, from decaying plants, from animal waste. Some wash in during floods, others seep slowly through groundwater. Once in the river, they fuel algae and microscopic organisms, which are consumed by insects, which are in turn eaten by fish and amphibians, and so on up the food chain. Even animals that leave the river contribute back to it. Salmon that die after spawning provide nutrients not just to scavengers, but to forests themselves, as bears drag carcasses onto land and leave behind fragments that fertilize the soil. In this way, rivers blur the boundaries between ecosystems, feeding land as much as they feed themselves. Rivers are also biodiversity hotspots. The Amazon River basin alone is home to more than 2,000 species of fish, more than are found in the entire Atlantic Ocean. The Mekong in Southeast Asia supports giant catfish, freshwater stingrays, and a dazzling variety of smaller species, many of them found nowhere else. The Congo River, with its powerful rapids and deep channels, harbours unique cichlids and other fish adapted to turbulent conditions. Even smaller rivers and streams, though less celebrated, are often full of endemic species that exist only in particular valleys or watersheds. A river, no matter how modest, is rarely empty. The richness of river life extends to the tiny and often overlooked. Insects such as mayflies, caddisflies and stoneflies spend most of their lives underwater as larvae, clinging to rocks and feeding on algae. When they mature into winged adults, they emerge in synchronized swarms, becoming a feast for birds, bats and fish. Mussels and clams sit quietly on riverbeds, filtering water and cleaning it as they feed. Some mussel species even rely on fish to complete their life cycle, attaching their larvae to fish gills for transport before dropping off to settle elsewhere. Beneath the surface, entire dramas unfold that most passers-by never notice. Floodplains and wetlands connected to rivers expand this richness even further. When rivers spill over their banks, they create temporary lakes and marshes that become breeding grounds for fish, birds and amphibians. Nutrients spread widely, fueling plant growth and insect booms. Migratory species time their movements to coincide with these pulses of abundance. In the Pantanal of Brazil, the world's largest tropical wetland, seasonal flooding turns the landscape into a paradise of biodiversity, with caimans basking, capybaras grazing, and thousands of bird species filling the skies. Here, the life within rivers spills outward, shaping entire landscapes of abundance. Yet river life is delicate. Pollution, dams and habitat loss disrupt these finely tuned systems. When water quality declines, sensitive species like amphibians disappear first. When dams block migration routes, fish that travel upstream to spawn are cut off from their life cycle. Invasive species can outcompete native ones, altering the balance that has held for millennia. A river ecosystem may appear robust, but it relies on countless small interactions. Break enough of those links and the web unravels. Despite these challenges, rivers remain resilient. Restoration projects have shown that when dams are removed or water quality improves, life often rushes back. Salmon return to long block streams, otters reappear, and bird populations rebound. This resilience reminds us that rivers are not static but dynamic, able to heal if given the chance. They have been supporting life for millions of years, and with care they will continue to do so for millions more. To think of a river as merely a body of water is to miss its true essence. A river is a symphony of species, each voice playing its part in the endless flow of energy and nutrients. It is a corridor of life that links mountains to seas, insects to birds, and forest to floodplains. From the smallest larvae clinging to a pebble to the eagle soaring above, the river is alive at every scale. And as long as it flows, that life flows with it, reminding us that beneath the surface of even the quietest stream, entire worlds are moving, thriving, and singing the eternal song of water. Rivers may seem like narrow threads of water winding across the land, but in truth they are part of a vast and interconnected climate system. They carry rain from mountains to the sea, regulate temperatures across landscapes, and tie together weather patterns near and far. To follow a river is not only to trace its geography, but also to glimpse the hidden workings of the atmosphere and the delicate balance of Earth's climate. One of the most immediate ways rivers influence climate is through the transport of heat. Water has a remarkable capacity to store and release energy. During the day, rivers absorb sunlight, warming gradually, and at night they release that heat back into the air. This process smooths out extremes, softening hot days and cool nights for communities along the banks. Anyone who has camped near a river knows the air is cooler in the heat of summer and warmer in the chill of autumn evenings. Rivers act as thermal regulators, modest in scale compared to oceans but significant for local climates. The water flowing through rivers is also a conveyor belt for the hydrological cycle. Rain and snow melt that would otherwise pool or stagnate are gathered and transported to seas and oceans, where they eventually evaporate, form clouds, and return again as rain. In this way, rivers connect sky to land to ocean in an endless cycle. Without rivers, rainfall patterns would be disrupted, and vast areas might become waterlogged or barren. They are in effect the drainage and recycling system of the planet, making climate stability possible. Evaporation from rivers, though smaller than from oceans, still plays a part in local weather. The moisture rising from wide river surfaces can feed thunderstorms, particularly in tropical regions. The Amazon, for example, is so vast that its river network contributes measurable amounts of vapour back into the atmosphere. This moisture helps sustain the rainforest, which in turn releases even more water vapour through the trees. Scientists sometimes describe the Amazon as a flying river because of this cycle, where water that falls as rain in one part of the basin may be released again hundreds of miles away, feeding clouds and storms far downstream. Floods demonstrate another dimension of a river's role in climate. When heavy rains arrive, rivers act as conduits, channeling excess water across landscapes. Floodplains temporarily store this overflow, preventing water from surging unchecked into oceans. In doing so, they act as shock absorbers in the climate system. Yet floods can also be destructive, sweeping away homes and fields. Their frequency and intensity are closely tied to broader weather patterns. The El Niño phenomenon in the Pacific, for instance, can bring unusual floods to South America, while simultaneously drying out parts of Asia. Thus, rivers are not only shaped by climate but also help express its moods. The opposite problem, drought, reveals another side of the story. When rains fail, rivers shrink, exposing dry beds and cracked mud. Communities that rely on them for water, farming, and industry suffer immediately. The Colorado River in the United States has become a stark example of this, with prolonged droughts reducing its flow so severely that it sometimes fails to reach the sea. In Africa, the Niger and Limpopo rivers have both seen dramatic reductions during dry spells, leading to crop failures and water shortages. A diminished river is not just a local inconvenience. It is a sign that climate patterns are shifting. Climate change amplifies both floods and droughts, stressing rivers in ways that past centuries rarely witnessed. Warmer air holds more moisture, which means storms can deliver heavier rainfall, leading to more extreme floods. At the same time, altered wind patterns and rising temperatures increase evaporation, leaving some regions parched. Glaciers that feed major rivers, such as those in the Himalayas and Andes, are retreating rapidly. At first, this increases river flow, but in the long run it threatens to reduce the steady supply of meltwater that millions of people depend upon. The Ganges, Indus and Yangtze are all at risk from this disappearing ice, making climate change not just a global issue, but a profoundly local one for communities along their banks. Rivers also play a quieter role in regulating carbon. Wetlands and floodplains associated with rivers store vast amounts of organic matter. When these areas are healthy, they trap carbon in soils and vegetation, helping to slow climate change. When they are drained or degraded, that carbon is released, adding to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Peatlands along rivers in places like Southeast Asia and Northern Europe are particularly important in this regard. They act like climate savings banks, holding carbon for centuries unless disturbed. Beyond science, rivers influence how people perceive and respond to climate. Because they are so visible, their fluctuations often serve as the first signs of larger changes. A receding riverbank or a flood that reaches farther than before becomes a lived experience of climate variability. Farmers in Egypt once watched the height of the Nile flood to predict harvests. Today, satellite images of rivers shrinking or swelling remind the modern world of how closely tied human futures are to these watery corridors. The ecological connections are equally profound. When rivers dry, fish populations collapse, birds lose feeding grounds, and plants wither along their banks. When floods intensify, they may scour habitats but also replenish them with nutrients. This rhythm of give and take has always been part of natural cycles, but under climate change it grows less predictable. Species adapted to steady patterns may struggle when extremes arrive too frequently. For example, spawning cycles of fish tied to spring floods may be disrupted if floods occur earlier or later than usual, throwing off delicate ecological timing. Despite these challenges, rivers remain resilient agents in the climate system. Restoration projects show that reconnected floodplains can absorb excess water, reducing flood risks while creating wildlife habitats. Reforestation along riverbanks cools local climates and stabilizes soils, improving water quality. Even small interventions, such as allowing meanders to return to formerly straightened channels, can improve a river's role in climate regulation. These efforts highlight how closely human decisions are tied to the fate of rivers and, by extension, to the climate. There is also something deeply symbolic about rivers and climate. Both are in constant motion, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, always reshaping the world around them. Just as no one can step into the same river twice, no community experiences the same climate year after year. Both systems remind us that change is the norm, balance is delicate, and persistence is key. To watch a river is to watch climate in miniature, the cycle of rain, evaporation, flow, and renewal playing out day after day. And to watch climate is to see rivers mirrored at a larger scale, global currents of air and water circulating endlessly around the planet. Together, they are not separate systems, but parts of one great whole. So when a river rises in flood or dwindles in drought, it is not merely a local event. It is a glimpse of the planet breathing, a sign of how intimately connected we are to the rhythms of water and weather. Rivers are not only shaped by climate, they are participants in it, steady companions in the grand atmospheric dance that governs life on Earth. Rivers have always invited curiosity. Their courses vanish into distant mountains or disappear into the horizon of the sea, and for much of human history those unknown stretches stirred imaginations as powerfully as they stirred trade. Some chose to follow rivers in search of knowledge, others for conquest, and still others for inspiration. To drift along the world's waterways is to trace a literary and scientific tradition, a tapestry woven by explorers, poets, and storytellers who found in rivers a companion to their journeys. One of the earliest to leave his thoughts about rivers was the ancient Greek historian Herodotus. Writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, he recorded stories about the Nile, that mysterious river flowing north through the desert. Herodotus never followed it to its source, but that did not stop him from speculating. He gathered tales from travellers and locals, sometimes relaying credible observations, at other times passing along myths with a twinkle of skepticism. To him, the Nile's annual flood was both a marvel and a puzzle. Why should a river swell in the dry season, when no rain fell in Egypt? He considered explanations involving melting snow, winds, and divine intervention. Today we know that the rains of the Ethiopian highlands were the answer, but the fact that Herodotus puzzled so deeply over the question shows how rivers have always challenged human understanding. His musings, half geography, half curiosity, reveal a mind entranced by water's mysteries. Centuries later, in the Age of Enlightenment, Alexander von Humboldt carried the tradition of river journeys into new scientific territory. In the early 19th century, he ventured into South America, determined to understand its landscapes and ecosystems. Among his most famous travels was his exploration of the Orinoco River. With a small team, he paddled through dense jungle, measuring currents, cataloguing plants, and recording observations that would shape modern ecology. One of his great insights came from noticing how river systems connect. He documented a natural canal linking the Orinoco and the Amazon basins, a discovery that demonstrated the interconnectedness of watersheds across vast distances. Humboldt's writing was more than scientific data. It was infused with wonder. He described the night sky mirrored in the river's surface, the calls of unseen animals echoing through the forest, and the overwhelming sense of vitality pulsing in the tropics. His accounts inspired generations of scientists, writers, and even politicians. Simón Bolívar, the revolutionary who helped liberate much of South America, was moved by Humboldt's vision of a unified natural world. Charles Darwin later called him the greatest scientific traveller who ever lived. The Orinoco was not just a waterway in Humboldt's eyes. It was a thread tying together climate, biology, and human destiny. Not all river journeys were scientific expeditions. Some were literary wanderings, drifting in words as much as in boats. Few captured the spirit of a river more vividly than Mark Twain on the Mississippi. Born Samuel Clemens, Twain spent his youth as a steamboat pilot navigating the great American river. Those experiences found their way into his memoir Life on the Mississippi and his classic novel Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Through Twain's eyes, the river was at once a stage for comedy, danger, and reflection. He wrote of the tricks of navigation, how a river might change its channel overnight, how sandbars shifted unpredictably, how a pilot had to memorize every bend and landmark. But beyond technical detail, Twain infused the river with character. It was a teacher, offering him discipline and patience. It was a playground, carrying boys on rafts toward freedom. It was also a mirror of America itself, reflecting both its promise and its contradictions. The Mississippi in Twain's pages is not just a geographic feature, it is a living presence, timeless yet ever-changing, stubbornly refusing to be tamed. Rivers have also carried quieter travellers, poets who found inspiration in their flow. The English poet William Wordsworth composed verses along the River Wye, capturing in lines written a few miles above Tintern Abbey the power of rivers to shape memory and emotion. His reflections tied the river's meanders to the meanders of thought, linking natural scenery with spiritual renewal. For Wordsworth, a walk by the river was not merely exercise but a deep encounter with the sublime. In Asia, poets of the Tang dynasty often wrote about rivers as metaphors for longing, friendship, or the passage of time. A farewell poem might describe friends parting at a riverbank, the current carrying away not only their boats but also their shared moments. The great Chinese poet Li Bai often celebrated rivers in his works, sometimes with a wine cup in hand, marvelling at moonlight shimmering across the Yangtze. In these verses, rivers were both physical realities and poetic mirrors of the human condition. Not every river journey has been gentle. For explorers pushing into unknown regions, rivers were both guides and hazards. The 19th century British adventurer Richard Burton endured fevers, insects and exhaustion on the Congo, while others perished trying to map the Nile's headwaters. David Livingstone's quest for the source of the Nile became legend, blending exploration with missionary zeal, though the ultimate discovery would fall to others. Rivers often hid dangers, cataracts that shattered boats, rapids that overturned rafts, diseases carried by insects along the banks. Yet for many explorers, the risks were worth the reward of charting the blank spaces on maps. Some river journeys were not quests for discovery, but acts of survival. Indigenous peoples around the world mastered their rivers long before outsiders arrived. The Polynesians navigated vast stretches of the Pacific, but also used rivers to reach inland settlements. In the Amazon, countless tribes developed intricate knowledge of waterways, knowing which streams were navigable in the wet season, which held dangerous currents, and which could be trusted for fishing. To them, the river was not a mystery to be solved, but a relative to be respected. Stories passed down in oral traditions told of spirits inhabiting river bends, of animals gifted by the currents, of ancestors who had paddled before. Even in the modern era, rivers continue to inspire journeys of imagination. Writers still take to kayaks and canoes, chronicling the slow passage of water and time. Environmentalists retrace ancient routes to highlight conservation, while travellers drift downstream seeking the quiet rhythm of nature. A river trip today may be less about discovering uncharted lands and more about rediscovering connection with the landscape, with history, with oneself. What unites all these journeys, Herodotus puzzling over the Nile, Humboldt in his canoe on the Orinoco, Twain watching the Mississippi by moonlight, is the recognition that rivers are more than channels of water. They are invitations. They call people to follow them, to wonder where they begin and end, to ask what lies beyond the bend. Each journey, whether scientific, poetic or personal, becomes part of the greater story of rivers themselves. And so the tradition continues. Rivers flow on, indifferent yet generous, carrying boats, ideas, and imaginations. Explorers may change, technologies may advance, but the allure of following a river remains timeless. To journey upon one is to step into a current of history, to join a procession of travellers who, across centuries, have looked at a flowing stream and thought, let us see where it might take us. Throughout history, rivers have flowed not only through landscapes, but through human imagination. They have been painted onto canvas, sung in melodies, and woven into poetry as symbols of time, change, and continuity. If mountains are monuments of permanence, rivers are muses of motion. Their ever-shifting currents seem to carry meaning as effortlessly as they carry water, inspiring artists and writers to capture their essence in words, brushstrokes, and song. Painters have long been captivated by rivers, fascinated by the way they catch light, reflect skies, and win through valleys. In the 19th century, J.M.W. Turner captured rivers in his landscapes, often bathed in misty golden light or swept up in stormy drama. For Turner, rivers were not static backgrounds but dynamic forces, sometimes calm and pastoral, other times turbulent and threatening. His scenes along the Thames, for example, show the river as both an everyday reality of London life and a stage for sublime natural spectacle. The Impressionists, too, found endless inspiration in riverbanks. Claude Monet painted the Seine repeatedly, recording its moods in different hours and seasons. His brushstrokes made water shimmer, ripple, and dance across the canvas, revealing the river as a living, breathing subject rather than a mere feature of geography. Literature has perhaps embraced rivers most deeply. Ancient epics often include river crossings as symbolic thresholds. In Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the Scamander and other rivers stand as obstacles to heroes. In Virgil's Aeneid, the river Styx marks the boundary between life and death, a motif that endured through centuries of Western imagination. In English poetry, rivers appear as muses of reflection. William Wordsworth's Lines Written a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey draws emotional power from the Wye, the river's flow mirroring the poet's own memory and growth. John Keats, contemplating the Thames, found in its waters a source of both melancholy and beauty. To read these verses is to sense how rivers offered poets a moving metaphor, a companion in thought as well as in scenery. Beyond individual poems, entire traditions celebrated rivers. Chinese poets of the Tang dynasty frequently wrote of rivers as symbols of parting, longing, and the passage of time. Friends saying farewell at a riverbank imagined the current carrying their sorrow downstream. Li Bai and Du Fu, two of the era's greatest poets, often looked to rivers for inspiration, sometimes drinking wine by moonlit waters, sometimes lamenting floods, but always treating rivers as intimate presences. In Japanese haiku, rivers often stand as fleeting images, linking natural detail with human emotion in just a handful of words. Music too has echoed with the flow of rivers. Spirituals in the American South often used rivers as symbols of freedom and salvation. The song Deep River, sung by enslaved Africans and their descendants, looked to the Jordan as a metaphor for crossing from hardship into peace. Later, in the 20th century, Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein's Old Man River, written for the musical Showboat, gave voice to the Mississippi itself. The river, in this song, is indifferent to human struggle, rolling along endlessly while lives come and go. It is at once comforting in its constancy and sobering in its indifference, a reminder of how nature's rhythms dwarf human concerns. Classical composers also turn to rivers for inspiration. Bedřich Smetana's symphonic poem Vltava traces the journey of the Czech River from its source to its merging with the Elbe, painting in music the flow of water past forest, villages and castles. The piece moves from gentle ripples to surging waves, capturing both the geography of the land and the spirit of the nation. In this way, rivers serve not only as musical themes, but as emblems of identity and pride. Folklore abounds with stories where rivers are characters in their own right. In Slavic tales, river spirits known as rusalki dwell in the waters, luring the unwary. In Native American traditions, rivers often appear as wise teachers or as paths for the souls of the dead. In African storytelling, rivers can be both dangerous tricksters and generous providers. These stories reflect not only practical awareness of rivers' importance, but also the deep emotional connection people felt with them. To personify a river was to acknowledge its power and presence in daily life. Modern writers have continued this fascination. In Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the Congo River becomes a metaphor for both a physical journey into Africa and a symbolic journey into the human soul. In Toni Morrison's Beloved, rivers are places of crossing and transformation, linked to themes of memory and identity. American literature in particular has often leaned on rivers to explore ideas of freedom, change, and the search for belonging. The Mississippi, thanks in part to Twain, has become almost mythic, a stage where national stories of aspiration and conflict play out. Rivers in art and literature are rarely neutral. They carry symbolism as readily as they carry sediment. A calm river can stand for peace, a raging torrent for turmoil. A bend in the current suggests mystery, the unseen future hidden beyond the next curve. Crossing a river becomes a metaphor for transition, whether from youth to adulthood, from one life stage to another, or from life to death itself. The universality of these themes explains why rivers recur so often across cultures and centuries. Even photography has embraced the river's allure. Early black and white images often sought to capture the shimmer of light on water, the quiet dignity of bridges spanning broad channels, or the energy of rapids in mountain gorges. In modern times, rivers have become subjects of environmental art and activism. Photographers document polluted rivers to highlight ecological damage, while others focus on pristine waters to inspire conservation. Once again, rivers prove that they can be both aesthetic subjects and symbols of human responsibility. Perhaps what makes rivers such enduring muses is their dual nature. They are constant yet changing, familiar yet unpredictable. A river you knew as a child is never quite the same when you return decades later. It may have shifted its banks, deepened its channel, or changed its course. This quality resonates deeply with artists and writers, who often seek to capture change within continuity. The river becomes an image of time itself, flowing endlessly forward, carrying us with it. There is also the sheer sensory appeal of rivers. Painters revel in the way water reflects light. Poets find music in its murmur, and musicians imitate its rhythms in melody. Rivers engage sight, sound, and touch, all at once. They invite contemplation, whether one is watching ripples spread across a pond, listening to the rush of rapids, or feeling the coolness of water lapping at the shore. To create art about a river is to translate these sensations into another medium, to share the experience with others. When we look across centuries of human creativity, rivers emerge again and again as threads of inspiration. They appear on canvas, in verse, in song, in myth, in symphony. They are backdrops and characters, symbols and realities. From Turner's stormy Thames to Monet's shimmering Seine, from Wordsworth's quiet Wye to Twain's mighty Mississippi, from Smetana's Vltava to the deep spirituals of the Jordan, rivers have given humanity more than water. They have given us meaning, and perhaps this is the ultimate gift of rivers in art and literature. They allow us to reflect on ourselves. In their flow we see our own passage through time, in their depths our own mysteries, and in their endurance our own hopes for continuity. To be inspired by a river is to acknowledge that we too are part of a current greater than ourselves, always moving, always changing, always flowing towards something beyond the horizon. For most of history, rivers flowed as they pleased. They flooded fields, carved new channels, and sometimes shifted course entirely, indifferent to the wishes of the people who lived beside them. Yet humans, never content to let nature run the whole show, gradually found ways to bend rivers to their needs. Irrigation channels, dams, and canals became tools of control, turning the restless energy of flowing water into power, food, and transport. But each of these triumphs has come with costs often as dramatic as the benefits. The earliest attempts at harnessing rivers were not about power, but survival. In Mesopotamia, some 6,000 years ago, farmers dug canals from the Tigris and Euphrates to water their crops. By directing the floods rather than simply enduring them, they could grow food more reliably. Ancient Egypt too learned to tame the Nile with basins and dikes, capturing the annual floodwaters to irrigate fields. These early systems were simple in design, yet revolutionary in effect. They turned rivers into reliable partners, enabling the rise of civilizations that depended on grain harvest to feed growing populations. As societies became more ambitious, their river projects grew in scale. The Romans were masters of aqueducts, carrying water across valleys and into cities with stone arches that still impress engineers today. Though aqueducts did not usually carry rivers themselves, they were built on the principle of channeling water with precision, ensuring that urban centres could thrive far from natural sources. In China, the Grand Canal was begun as early as the 5th century before the Common Era, and later expanded into a colossal project linking the Yangtze and Yellow rivers. Stretching over 1,000 miles, it allowed rice from the south to be transported northward, binding the empire together with a watery thread. The impulse to control rivers often sprang from a desire for stability. Floods could destroy crops and towns, while droughts could wither fields. By building levees and canals, people sought to take command of these natural rhythms. Yet stability sometimes came at the cost of flexibility. Over time, soils in Mesopotamia grew salty, as irrigation water evaporated, leaving minerals behind. Fields that had once been fertile turned barren, a reminder that managing rivers is never a one-time victory but a delicate balance that requires constant care. With the rise of modern technology, humans shifted from simply diverting rivers to harnessing their energy. Dams became the great monuments of the 20th century, blocking rivers to create reservoirs and channeling water through turbines to generate electricity. The Hoover Dam, built during the Great Depression on the Colorado River, became a symbol of engineering prowess and national determination. Behind its massive concrete wall, Lake Mead formed, storing water for cities and farms across the American West. The dam provided hydroelectric power, jobs, and a sense of mastery over an unpredictable desert river. Elsewhere, projects grew even larger. China's Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze is the biggest hydroelectric power station in the world, stretching more than a mile across and rising taller than many skyscrapers. Its turbines generate enough electricity to power entire provinces, while its reservoir allows ships to travel deeper into inland China than ever before. But the costs were immense. More than 1 million people were relocated as villages and towns were submerged. Historic sites disappeared beneath the rising water, and ecosystems were profoundly altered. The Yangtze's natural floods, once vital for renewing soils and wetlands, were tamed, with consequences that scientists are still measuring. Even smaller dams can have dramatic ecological effects. Salmon, which instinctively return to their spawning grounds, often find their paths blocked by concrete walls. Fish ladders and bypass systems are sometimes built to help them, but these do not always succeed. In North America and Europe, the decline of migratory fish has been closely linked to the spread of dams. Meanwhile, rivers that once flowed freely to the sea can be reduced to trickles downstream, deprived of the sediment that would normally build deltas and nourish coastlines. The Mississippi Delta's erosion, in part, stems from dams and levees upstream that trap silt. Canals, too, have left their mark. They are often seen as symbols of human ingenuity, cutting across landscapes to connect rivers, seas, and cities. The Suez Canal, completed in the 19th century, created a direct link between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, transforming global trade by saving ships from the long and dangerous voyage around Africa. The Panama Canal did the same for the Americas, linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans with a shortcut that altered world shipping routes forever. These canals were not merely engineering feats, but geopolitical game changers, shaping commerce and power on a global scale. Smaller canals also played vital roles in local economies. In Britain during the Industrial Revolution, networks of narrow canals carried coal, iron and textiles to factories and markets. Horses plodding along towpaths pulled barges laden with goods, turning rivers and artificial waterways into the beating heart of industrial growth. Though later overshadowed by railroads, these canals were crucial in fueling the revolution that transformed society. But again, human control of rivers is not without irony. To regulate floods, we often build levees, only to discover that these structures sometimes make floods worse by preventing rivers from spreading harmlessly across floodplains. To generate electricity, we block rivers, only to see ecosystems unravel. To create shipping shortcuts, we dig canals, only to watch invasive species slip through the new connections and colonize waters where they never belonged. The zebra mussel, for instance, travelled through canals and shipping routes to spread across North America, clogging pipes and altering ecosystems. Culturally, rivers lose something when they are caged. Where once they inspired myths and rituals with their natural rhythms, now they often become reservoirs or channels with regulated flows. The wild unpredictability that gave them symbolic power is subdued. Communities displaced by dams lose not only homes but also the intangible heritage tied to landscapes that vanish beneath reservoirs. Ancient temples, burial grounds, and sacred sites often end up underwater, sacrificed for electricity and irrigation. Yet it would be unfair to cast human efforts at control as purely destructive. Irrigation has enabled billions to be fed. Hydropower provides a renewable source of energy that reduces reliance on fossil fuels. Canals have connected the world in ways unimaginable to earlier generations. The challenge lies in striking a balance, in learning from past mistakes, and seeking methods that work with rivers rather than against them. Modern projects increasingly emphasize sustainability, building smaller dams that minimize ecological disruption, restoring natural floodplains to reduce disaster risks, and designing canals with ecological safeguards. Ultimately, our relationship with rivers reveals as much about us as about the rivers themselves. We are a species that seeks control, yet we live on a planet that resists it. Rivers remind us that even when dammed or diverted, water finds ways to flow. Reservoirs fill with silt, levees break, canals require constant maintenance. The illusion of absolute mastery rarely lasts. What endures is the dialogue between human ambition and natural persistence. To stand before a great dam or watch a ship pass through a canal lock is to marvel at human ingenuity. To stand at the mouth of a shrinking delta or beside a dried-out riverbed is to feel the weight of unintended consequences. Both experiences are part of the same story. Our ongoing attempt to guide rivers, to turn their restless energy into something predictable. But rivers, for all our efforts, always remind us of their own agency. They are not simply resources to be managed, but living systems whose flow shapes our lives as much as we try to shape theirs. Rivers, for all their strength and persistence, are also vulnerable. They can carve valleys and carry continents of sediment, yet they are easily poisoned by what flows into them. Over the past 2 centuries, as industry, agriculture, and cities expanded, rivers have borne the brunt of humanity's waste. From dyes and chemicals to plastics and untreated sewage, the arteries of the earth have too often been treated as convenient disposal systems. The result is a sobering picture. Waters once teeming with life turned foul, ecosystems disrupted, and communities left without safe drinking water. And yet, alongside this tale of damage runs another story, one of resilience, renewal, and the possibility of recovery. Industrial waste was one of the earliest assaults. As factories multiplied during the Industrial Revolution, rivers became dumping grounds for dyes, tars, and heavy metals. In England, the River Irwell ran black with chemical discharge from Manchester's mills. In Germany, stretches of the Rhine were once so polluted that fish vanished entirely. In the United States, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio became infamous when it caught fire multiple times in the 20th century because oil and chemical slicks floating on its surface were so thick they could ignite. These fiery blazes shocked the public into recognizing how dire river pollution had become. Agriculture, too, has left its mark. Fertilizers rich in nitrogen and phosphorus wash from fields into rivers, feeding algae that grow in explosive blooms. When these blooms die and decompose, they consume oxygen, leaving behind dead zones where fish and other aquatic life cannot survive. The Mississippi carries so many nutrients from farms across the American Midwest that every summer a vast dead zone appears in the Gulf of Mexico, an area sometimes larger than the state of New Jersey. Similar problems occur in rivers feeding the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and countless lakes and estuaries worldwide. What begins as a farmer's attempt to boost crop yields ends as a systemic disruption hundreds of miles downstream. Plastics have introduced a more modern challenge. Rivers act as conveyor belts for plastic waste, carrying bottles, bags, and microplastics from cities to the oceans. Studies suggest that a small number of major rivers, such as the Yangtze, Ganges, and Niger, deliver the bulk of plastic debris into seas. In some urban stretches, it is difficult to see the water beneath the floating trash. Yet even when plastics break down into smaller fragments, they remain harmful, entering food chains as fish and shellfish mistake them for food. The river, once a source of nourishment, becomes a pathway of toxins. Chemicals add another layer of concern. Pesticides, pharmaceuticals, and industrial solvents seep into rivers, often invisible but no less dangerous. Traces of antibiotics and hormones have been detected in waterways across Europe and North America, altering the behavior and reproduction of fish. Mercury from mining operations accumulates in sediments and then in fish, travelling up the food chain to affect humans. In some rivers, the problem is so severe that governments warn against eating locally caught fish at all. These invisible pollutants remind us that a river can look clear and clean while carrying an unseen burden. Yet amid these challenges, there are stories of remarkable recovery. The Thames in London was declared biologically dead in the mid-19th century after centuries of sewage and industrial pollution. By the mid-20th century, things were little better, and the river had earned a reputation as a stinking, lifeless channel. But efforts to clean it, treat wastewater, and restore habitats have transformed it into a thriving ecosystem once again. Today, more than 100 species of fish inhabit its waters, and seals and even porpoises have been sighted near the city. A river once written off as hopeless has proven resilient when given care. The Rhine in Europe tells a similar story. Once nicknamed the sewer of Europe, it was heavily polluted by chemicals from factories along its course. In 1986, a catastrophic fire at a chemical plant in Switzerland spilled tons of toxic pesticides into the river, killing fish along hundreds of miles. The disaster galvanized international cooperation. Countries along the Rhine worked together to regulate pollutants, improve wastewater treatment, and restore habitats. By the early 21st century, salmon had returned to the river after being absent for more than half a century. What had seemed an ecological tragedy became a turning point toward recovery. Even the Cuyahoga River, once a symbol of industrial neglect, has found renewal. After its notorious fires, public outrage spurred the creation of the United States Environmental Protection Agency and the Clean Water Act. Regulations forced industries to limit discharges and invest in treatment. Today, the Cuyahoga supports fish and bird life, and its rebirth is celebrated as an example of how communities can reclaim polluted rivers. What was once a global embarrassment has become a story of resilience. These cases show that while rivers are vulnerable, they are also forgiving. Given the chance, ecosystems rebound. Plants recolonize banks, fish return, and birds follow. The flow of water dilutes and carries away contaminants once the sources are controlled. Unlike some environments that take centuries to heal, rivers often respond within decades. Their movement, which once made them efficient conveyors of waste, also makes them effective at self-renewal. Still, challenges remain immense. In many parts of the world, pollution continues unchecked. Rivers in South and Southeast Asia face extraordinary pressure from untreated sewage, industrial effluent, and plastic waste. The Ganges, sacred to millions, struggles under the weight of pollutants, even as efforts are made to clean it. In Africa, rapid urban growth has outpaced infrastructure, leaving rivers choked with garbage and chemicals. Even in wealthy nations, new contaminants such as microplastics and pharmaceuticals pose questions regulators are only beginning to answer. The cultural costs of polluted rivers are harder to measure but no less real. When a river is fouled, it loses its role as a gathering place, a source of pride or a setting for ritual. Communities that once swam, fished or held festivals on its banks may turn away in disgust. Folklore and songs that celebrated the river fade into silence. To pollute a river is not only to harm nature, but also to diminish the human relationship with place and memory. Solutions require more than technology. They demand shifts in attitude. Wastewater treatment plants, better farming practices, and stricter regulations are vital. But so too is the cultural recognition that rivers are not waste dumps but living systems. Efforts to ban single-use plastics, restore wetlands that filter water, and reforest riverbanks all contribute to healthier rivers. Public awareness campaigns often use art, festivals, and storytelling to rekindle affection for rivers, reminding people that protecting them is as much about identity as it is about ecology. In the end, rivers are both fragile and strong. They can be poisoned by careless acts yet recover when given the chance. They remind us that while damage can be swift, healing is possible with patience and care. A polluted river is a warning, but a recovered one is a promise that humanity and nature can find balance again. Each success story, from the Thames to the Rhine to the Cuyahoga, stands as proof that rivers are not doomed to decline. They are living systems, resilient veins of the earth, waiting for us to treat them with the respect they have always deserved. To think about the future of rivers is to imagine the fate of our own societies, for the two are inseparably bound. As the climate warms and human demands continue to grow, rivers will stand at the centre of the great challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. They will not be mere backdrops to history, but key actors in the unfolding story of survival, adaptation, and renewal. In a warming world, rivers will experience change on every front. Glaciers that feed great waterways like the Indus, Ganges, and Yangtze are retreating rapidly. In the short term, this may swell rivers as meltwater increases, but in the long term it threatens to diminish the steady flows that billions of people depend upon for drinking, farming, and hydropower. Meanwhile, rainfall patterns are shifting, delivering torrential downpours in some regions and prolonged droughts in others. Floods and dry spells, once considered rare or cyclical, are becoming less predictable. Rivers that have always been trusted to behave in certain ways may begin to surprise, sometimes with devastating consequences. Urban growth adds to the pressure. By mid-century, most of the world's population will live in cities, and many of those cities sit beside rivers. The demands of these growing urban centres, water supply, sanitation, industry, and energy, will stretch rivers further than ever before. Already, some waterways like the Colorado and the Yellow River struggle to reach the sea because so much of their flow is diverted upstream. In the future, the challenge will not simply be whether rivers can support life as they once did, but whether they can support human ambition without collapsing under the strain. And yet, alongside these worries, there is reason for hope. Rivers, unlike many systems, have an extraordinary capacity for recovery. They are dynamic by nature, always shifting and remaking themselves. When pollution is reduced, when barriers are removed, when floodplains are reconnected, rivers often rebound with surprising speed. Fish return, wetlands reappear, and ecosystems revive. This resilience is perhaps the most encouraging sign for the future. It suggests that even though we have pushed rivers hard, they can forgive us if we choose to treat them differently. Restoration has already shown what is possible. In parts of Europe, old dams have been dismantled, allowing salmon and sturgeon to swim upstream for the first time in centuries. The Elwha River in Washington state, once blocked by two massive dams, has been freed in recent years. Within a single decade of dam removal, fish populations surged, riverbanks greened, and the river carved new channels through its restored floodplain. This transformation has become a beacon for river conservation worldwide, a reminder that healing can happen more quickly than many expect. Conservation efforts are also evolving beyond the simple preservation of pristine rivers. Increasingly, attention is turning to working rivers, those heavily used by people, and asking how they can be managed more sustainably. It may not be possible to return the Yangtze or the Mississippi to some imagined natural state, but it is possible to make them healthier, cleaner, and more resilient. Better agricultural practices can reduce fertilizer runoff, new wastewater treatment technologies can filter out microplastics and pharmaceuticals, and smarter dam design can balance energy needs with ecological flows. The future of rivers will likely not be about choosing between nature and people, but finding ways for both to coexist. Another source of optimism lies in the growing recognition of rivers as more than resources. Many governments, communities, and even courts are beginning to treat rivers as legal entities with rights of their own. In New Zealand, the Wanganui River has been granted legal personhood, meaning it can be represented in court. In India, courts have attempted to extend similar recognition to the Ganges and Yamuna. These moves, though symbolic in some ways, reflect a profound shift in perception. Rivers are not simply things to be used, but beings to be respected and protected. If such ideas continue to spread, they could reshape the way humanity manages its waterways. Technology, too, will play a role in shaping river futures. Remote sensing satellites already monitor river flows, sediment loads, and water quality from orbit, giving scientists the ability to track changes in real time. Artificial intelligence is being used to predict flood risks, optimize reservoir releases, and even design more effective wetlands for water filtration. Drones can map riverbanks to detect erosion, while sensors buried in riverbeds measure everything from temperature to nutrient levels. These tools will not eliminate challenges, but they can make management more precise and adaptive. Rivers will also become central in the broader fight against climate change. Restored wetlands and floodplains act as carbon sinks, absorbing and storing greenhouse gases. Healthy rivers help regulate local climates, cooling regions through evaporation and sustaining forests that store even more carbon. In this sense, taking care of rivers is not just an ecological duty but a climate strategy. Protecting rivers is protecting the very systems that protect us from further warming. But perhaps the greatest driver of change will be cultural. For too long, rivers have been seen as obstacles to tame or drains to exploit. That view is shifting. More and more, people are coming to see rivers as companions, heritage, and identity. Festivals celebrating river life, movements to clean up polluted stretches, and education programs teaching children about their local waterways all contribute to a new ethos of stewardship. In many cultures, ancient reverence for rivers is being revived, blending tradition with modern conservation. The future of rivers will be decided not only by engineers and policymakers, but by the collective affection and respect of communities who live along their banks. None of this will be easy. Climate pressures are real, demands are growing, and mistakes will undoubtedly continue. But the story of rivers has always been one of persistence. They cut through mountains, survive droughts, and adapt to change with quiet determination. If given space and care, they will continue to flow, not only as channels of water but as lifelines for cultures, ecosystems, and climates. To imagine rivers of the future is to imagine landscapes where human needs and natural rhythms are no longer in constant conflict. It is to see levees that double as wildlife habitats, cities that treat rivers as green corridors rather than drains, and farms that share water rather than exhaust it. It is to picture children once again swimming safely in urban rivers, fish returning to ancient spawning grounds, and wetlands alive with birds and insects. It is to believe that rivers, though tested, can still inspire the same awe, the same creativity, and the same reverence that they always have. In the end, the rivers of tomorrow will be shaped by the choices we make today. They can be choked by pollution, cut by dams and drained until they fade, or they can be restored, respected, and allowed to thrive. The future is not written in the currents yet. It is waiting, like water gathering at the headwaters, ready to flow where we guide it. And if we guide it wisely, the rivers of the future will not only endure but flourish, carrying both life and hope deep into the centuries ahead. Rivers have always been more than water. They are the veins of the earth, carrying life through landscapes in the same way blood carries vitality through a body. From tiny mountain springs to sprawling deltas, they course endlessly onward, connecting clouds to seas, mountains to plains, and people to one another. To look at a river is to see motion itself, patient, persistent, and purposeful. And though the scenery changes, though the banks shift and the currents alter, the river never truly stops. It is continuity in liquid form. We have wandered through their many stories, their births in rain and snow, their sculpting of valleys and plains, their roles in civilizations, myths, and commerce. We have watched them inspire poets, feed cities, and test the limits of human engineering. We have seen them wounded by pollution and reshaped by dams, yet also resilient, returning when given space to heal. Through every chapter, the same truth has revealed itself again and again. Rivers endure. Patience is their greatest strength. A single raindrop is nothing, but countless raindrops given centuries can carve a canyon. A flood may seem destructive in the moment, yet across time it builds fertile plains capable of feeding generations. A bend in the current may shift gradually, so slowly that no one notices, until one day a new lake gleams where none existed before. In this quiet way, rivers remind us that change need not be hurried to be profound. Persistence itself is power. There is something humbling in this. Human history often moves in fits and bursts, wars, inventions, revolutions. But rivers move differently. They carry on regardless of our noise, weaving our stories into their longer rhythm. They flowed before cities rose along their banks, and they will flow long after those cities are dust. To consider a river is to step outside the narrowness of a single lifetime and glimpse the patience of the earth itself. And yet rivers are not indifferent to us. We drink from them, bathe in them, grow food with their waters, and rest in their shade. They have shaped where we live, how we travel, and even how we imagine the world. To harm them is to harm ourselves, but to nurture them is to nurture our own future. Their health is our health, their persistence our persistence. They are not apart from us but within us, for even the blood flowing in our veins carries water that once flowed through a river. At night, rivers take on another role. Their murmur becomes a lullaby, their current a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. There is a reason people have always slept more soundly beside running water. The sound speaks to something deep within us, an ancient memory of safety and continuity. Perhaps that is why rivers make such fitting companions as we drift towards sleep. Their endless flow is reassurance that the world continues, that life carries on, even as we close our eyes. So as you rest now, let the thought of rivers accompany you. Picture their silver threads winding through forests, the green floods spilling across meadows, the calm reflections beneath city bridges. Imagine the long journey from mountain stream to delta, from drop of rain to rolling sea. Think of the lives they hold within, the fish, the birds, the reeds swaying in the shallows, all carried gently forward in the same current that has flowed for millions of years. Like rivers, our own stories rarely have neat endings. One chapter leads into the next, bends give way to new horizons, and the current carries us onward whether we see what lies ahead or not. That is part of their comfort, the knowledge that continuity exists even when our view is short. And so, here at the close of this journey together, let us end as rivers do, not with finality, but with quiet continuation. The words may pause, but the current flows on. The river you imagine tonight will keep flowing in the darkness, reshaping the land, nourishing life and carrying memory forward. Like a river, this story doesn't end. It simply continues somewhere beyond what we can see. Good night. May the rivers keep flowing softly in your dreams.